The thick hush of the library made every breath feel weighty. The polished oak floors, ancient and often repaired over centuries, bore the imprints of countless boots and sandals from novices, acolytes, and grand maesters alike. Parchments rustled in the far corners, where a handful of gray-robed scholars leafed through tomes under flickering candlelight. Beneath the dizzying heights of the vaulted ceiling, each shelf loomed with the hush of secrets, centuries of recorded knowledge, prophecies, records, treaties, bestiaries, ravings, and revelations that few outside the citadel would ever peruse. Maester Walgrave, stoop-shouldered and wrinkled, stood before a long table covered in scrolls and meticulously copied manuscripts. The citadel was home to many like him, men whose entire existence revolved around deciphering riddles of the past. In his trembling hands, Walgrave held a newly discovered fragment that smelled of stale ink and dust. He squinted at the words, struggling to decipher the High Valyrian script that, by all accounts, bore unusual flourishes and an archaic spelling seldom seen even in Oldtown's musty vaults. He had come across this fragment by chance, or so he kept telling himself. Perhaps the Seven had guided him, or maybe it was pure coincidence. He had been searching for genealogical records of certain lords, a mind-numbing task assigned by an archmaester who enjoyed punishing novices with tedium. But amid the bundles of documents he found a small wooden case, sealed with a golden chain, that rattled when lifted. The chain bore a tag in Old Tongue script, so old that it spoke of the earliest days of the Undulls. No clue was given of its contents. Feeling a thrill of curiosity, Walgrave retrieved his ring of keys. Alchemical, ravenry, healing, metalcraft, each a different shape, and tried them one after another until he found the right fit. Inside the case, a crumbling scroll. At first glance, it looked like a typical piece of devotional writing. Prayers to forgotten gods, maybe. Yet a phrase leapt at him. The Dragon Queen reborn at world's end. It was enough to make his heart hammer against his ribcage. The scribbles that followed spoke of burning seas and melting swords and the flight of crows over a scorched field of ice. Then a single name, Targaryen. It was the combination of those references that led to a feeling of deep unease in Walgrave's chest. This was no typical scroll. It had been deliberately sealed away, hidden, it seemed, from prying eyes, and it concerned the Targaryens, possibly the future, or the past, or perhaps both. In the moments that followed, Walgrave had hastily relocked the scroll in its wooden case, shrouded it in a spare length of cloth, and hustled away with it. His mind spun with questions he dared not speak aloud. For who was he to interpret prophecy? The Citadel took pride in its scholarship, not mysticism. The vow of a maester was to serve knowledge, to serve the realm. Yet knowledge itself could be a sharp blade, and sometimes the realm was safer in ignorance. In the privacy of his cramped chamber, Walgrave pored over the scroll by candlelight. The meaning was elusive, yet it circled around a repeated premise. The rightful scion of old Valyria, reborn amidst salt and smoke, would bring both destruction and salvation. At times, the text read as if describing the legendary Azor Ahai. But the mention of dragon and Targaryen was explicit. The text even hinted that her hair is pale as starlight, her eyes the color of lilacs. She is the storm of swords, born in the city of bells and dust. That alone gave him chills. He could see in his mind's eye the figure that rumor claimed was across the narrow sea. A Targaryen girl, Daenerys, said to have silver-gold hair and eyes of pale violet. Whispers had reached the citadel that she'd walked through fire to hatch dragons. Most maesters dismissed it as nonsense, but Walgrave had listened with a mixture of awe and dread. Late that night, he tucked the scroll in a secret compartment behind his bed. An old man's paranoia or caution, perhaps. He could sense that others might want to keep such a prophecy buried, or else twist it to their own ends. Meanwhile, a faint sense of purpose had welled up in him. The next morning, he took an excerpt of the text to Archmaester Hanias, a scholar of prophecy and portents. But Hanias barely glanced at the parchment. "A forgery, no doubt," he muttered with a derisive snort. "We've had thousands of so-called prophecies come through these halls. Not a one means anything in the end." The Archmaester turned away, returning to his notes on raven migration, as if Walgrave were a child prattling about superstitions. Dismissed, Walgrave had slunk away, and that might have been the end of it, another piece of nonsense lost in the labyrinth of Citadel archives. Yet Walgrave was too uneasy to let it lie. Every day, he found his thoughts drifting back to the image of dragons, to rumors of the silver-haired queen on the far side of the sea. He had read the stories of her hatching dragons in the red waste of Essos. He had heard travelers speak of her freeing slaves in Astapor, Yunkai, and Myrene. It all sounded impossibly grand, a swirl of rumor so improbable it could hardly be real. But what if it was real, and the old scroll's prophecy was about her? As the months wore on, the Citadel could not ignore the war brewing in the east. The War of the Five Kings had ravaged Westeros from within, but now there were whispers of a new threat. The Targaryen girl had ships. She had an army. She had dragons. A scattering of letters arrived, each from some different part of Essos, bringing news of a woman called Daenerys Stormborn who was forging alliances. Most maesters, proud in their logic, debated the feasibility of such an enterprise. After all, who among the great lords of Westeros would welcome a Targaryen back across the sea? But slowly, as the ravens kept coming, the name Daenerys Targaryen became impossible to brush aside. Walgrave studied each new report with mounting excitement and dread. One night, he made the long trek down to the vaults beneath the citadel, holding a torch that guttered in the cool subterranean air. The labyrinth of storage chambers was endless, but he knew precisely where to look, where he'd found the scroll's wooden case in the first place. He was determined to discover any other documents or references to the same prophecy. He rifled through old shipping records, genealogical charts, even tattered diaries. Hours passed. His breath grew stale in the enclosed space. At last, crouching on arthritic knees, he pried open a cask of ancient letters, many barely legible with mold and decay. One letter, though, was protected by a cunning leather wrap. The address had long since faded, but the seal still bore the mark of House Hightower. Inside, in elaborate script, a letter told of the hush that fell upon the Hightower the day Maester Quilion locked up the dragon's word. The letter referenced a date, some 200 years earlier. The dragon's word must have been a prophecy or something akin. The sense of secrecy was palpable. Too dangerous for mortal hands, the text concluded. Then no more. The letter ended abruptly. Clutching this crumb of evidence, Walgrave returned to his chamber. He read and reread the letter under lamplight until the candle's wick guttered out. He cast his memory back to his earliest days of study. Maester Quilion. That was a name that appeared in the annals of the Citadel but rarely. Stories said he'd been an oddity, brilliant in the fields of astronomy and languages, but rumored to dabble in the black arts, a claim Walgrave always dismissed as slander from superstitious novices. But now, it seemed this Quilion had locked away something. Possibly that same scroll, possibly more. A sudden vision struck Walgrave of Daenerys Targaryen crossing the narrow sea with fire in her wake, fulfilling an age-old prophecy not only of Azor Ahai but also a destruction from which the realm might never recover. Yet the realm was rarely starved for omens of doom. The question was, could a prophecy from Oldtown have shaped, or even predicted, Daenerys' entire life? Walgrave wondered if the Targaryen queen herself knew of this hidden text. Maybe she knew it by another name. Maybe she had never heard of it. Either possibility was unnerving. He could not forget the line, "The Dragon Queen reborn at world's end," nor the other cryptic references. Which path would she choose if she knew the prophecy? Salvation or destruction? Word spread in the citadel that Daenerys Targaryen had landed on Dragonstone. Many maesters scoffed. It made no sense, they insisted. She had the entire coastline of Westeros to choose from, so why an island fortress rumored to be nearly empty of supplies and gold? But Walgrave saw the logic. It was once the seat of Targaryen power, built by ancient Valyrians, rumored to be lined with volcanic tunnels. More importantly, if you believed the old stories, a place of mythic significance to House Targaryen. Perhaps the prophecy was moving forward. Perhaps it was all building to a crescendo that the old scroll had so direly predicted. It was not Walgrave alone who fretted. The highest echelon of the citadel began to murmur among themselves. Archmaester Hanias, who had dismissed Walgrave's fragment, now stomped from one end of the library to the other, complaining that the realm was in peril from a new Targaryen tyranny. Another Archmaester, Theobald, insisted the rumors of dragons were still exaggerations, illusions. The one who seemed calmest of all was Archmaester Raghan, who specialized in history. All Targaryen monarchs believed themselves chosen for something grand, he said in a measured tone. The question is not whether she believes it, but how many swords will believe it with her. Within weeks, new ravens arrived bearing more urgent messages. Daenerys' host had grown. She had formed alliances with powerful Westerosi houses, or so it was claimed. And there were tales, always tales, of her dragons. The realm, still wounded from the War of the Five Kings, now seemed poised to explode anew. The citadel prided itself on being neutral, above the petty conflicts of lords and ladies. But Walgrave saw the restlessness in the novices, the anxiety in the older maesters. Knowledge was power, and right now that power seemed dangerously fluid. In the darkness of one late evening, Walgrave was summoned by a quiet knock on his door. He opened it to find a novice wearing the half-maester's chain, young and pale-faced. "Archmaester Hanias summons you," the novice said in a hushed voice. Walgrave's heart fluttered. He followed the novice through the winding corridors, up a narrow staircase, and finally into Hanias's cluttered study. The Archmaester stood near a brazier that gave off a low orange glow. On a desk behind him lay the wooden case, the same one Walgrave had discovered. Its chain was broken again. Hanias turned, face stern. "I remembered your old nonsense about a Targaryen prophecy, Walgrave," he began. "So I had the novices search the vaults. We found more references from the days of Maester Quilion. Not many, but enough." He paused, sweeping his gaze over Walgrave's quivering form. "This is dangerous knowledge, best left locked away." Walgrave tried to speak, but Hanias raised a finger for silence. Then he tapped the wooden case. "Your prophecy, the Dragon Queen reborn at world's end. Quilion wrote that it would come to pass when the fires in the east had all but died. Some interpret that to mean the doom of Valyria centuries past. Others say it concerns the wars of Essos, but that's not what matters. The scroll also states, 'She will come to the high tower by flame.'" A hush settled. Walgrave could see Hanias's anxiety in the twitch of his brow. If the high tower itself, the pride of Oldtown, was threatened, no wonder Hanias felt uneasy. Oldtown was the citadel's home, the seat of House Hightower. If Daenerys came, it would mean war on the southwestern coast. The idea of dragons flying overhead, bathing the harbor in flame, Walgrave felt faint. He tried to gather his wits. Why hide this knowledge? If the realm is truly in danger, should we not advise the lords of Westeros? Or even communicate with Daenerys herself? Hanias's scowl deepened. Maester Quilion was no fool. He believed that to speak of prophecy is to shape it. The Citadel has always erred on the side of caution when it comes to these matters. We advise on facts, not mystic riddles. No good can come of telling lords or ladies that the Citadel has a hidden text prophesying the destruction of Oldtown. Walgrave's gaze flicked to the wooden case, lying open. But if it's true, if the arrival of Daenerys Targaryen has long been foretold, perhaps we have a responsibility. The Archmaester lifted a hand. "Enough. I simply wanted to let you know that we have it now, under lock and key. You will not speak of it to anyone. Understood?" His eyes burned with cold authority. Walgrave found himself nodding. Fear wrapped around him like a damp cloak. He wanted to protest, but his mind conjured the image of the prophecy and Daenerys Targaryen's unstoppable march. Whether Hanias liked it or not, such secrets rarely remained buried forever. It was only a matter of time before truth outed itself, sometimes in a blaze of dragon flame. In the weeks that followed, Walgrave lived in a state of quiet dread. Word reached the Citadel that Daenerys had indeed arrived at Dragonstone, that she was sending emissaries to houses all over Westeros, rallying support. Some laughed at her presumption. Others listened in fear. The citadel itself had not officially recognized her or crowned her. And while Walgrave tried to go about his normal tasks, copying manuscripts, assisting novices, penning treatises on healing, his mind drifted again and again to the prophecy. At night, after a dinner of bread and stew, he would wander the library's corridors, passing tall shelves of dusty tomes, thinking of the crumbling fragment with its cryptic lines. A mania grew in him, a sense that he was standing on the threshold of history, that something momentous was about to happen, and that, for reasons he couldn't fully articulate, he was entrusted with a secret that would change everything. Months passed. Daenerys fought battles on multiple fronts. Ravens carried contradictory accounts, some praising her fairness, others calling her a fiery tyrant. Then came the monstrous rumor that she had raised an entire Lannister caravan outside Highgarden, with Dragonflame turning soldiers to ash. The Citadel's corridors buzzed with hushed conversation. Some applauded the downfall of the Lannisters. Others feared what might come next. For Walgrave, it was a confirmation that the prophecy was not some fable. Dragons had indeed unleashed their fury on Westerosi soil. The line, "She will come to the high tower by flame," repeated in his mind. Was Oldtown next? One crisp morning, Walgrave woke early. He had not slept well. He had dreamt of swirling embers in the sky, of the high tower collapsing in smoke. Trying to chase the nightmares away with a mug of hot tea, he left his chamber and roamed the citadel's courtyard. It was dawn, and the rose-gold light bathed the towers in a gentle hue. He thought for a moment how ironic it was that a place of knowledge could stand at the edge of catastrophic events. Then he noticed a small figure in novice's robes scurrying across the courtyard, looking around furtively. The novice's name was Kevin, a shy boy from a minor knightly family. Kevin caught sight of Walgrave, froze, then hurried over. "Maester Walgrave," the boy whispered. Something strange. You should come." He tugged at the old man's sleeve, leading him inside, through shadowy corridors, and down a twisting flight of stairs to a small reading room seldom used. The door stood ajar. Light spilled through, illuminating a table on which the wooden case lay open. Unattended again. The old scroll unrolled across the tabletop. Walgrave's heart gave a start. There were footprints in the dust. Someone had been here recently. Then he saw that scattered around the scroll were small scraps of parchment, notes written in a spidery hand. Kevin's wide eyes darted between Walgrave and the door. I just found it like this," he stammered. "I swear I didn't read anything, but it looked so strange. I thought you should know." Approaching the table, Walgrave stooped over the notes. He recognized Hanias's handwriting. A few lines, references to the Hightower's defenses, records of Targaryen invasions, and a repeated mention of some cryptic phrase: the pale mare, the bells, the tears of father's ghost. Walgrave's breath quickened. The prophecy was being dissected, and Hanias, despite his earlier dismissal, was analyzing every line. Before he could speak, the door scraped open. Archmaester Hanias entered, accompanied by two others. He glowered at Kevin, who shrank back. Then Hanias fixed Walgrave with a furious stare. "This is a restricted text. Why are you here?" His tone brooked no argument. Walgrave swallowed, hearing his heart in his ears. "We found the door open, Archmaester. We were concerned. That is all." Hanias scowled. "Concern yourself with your duties. I will handle the rest." With that, Hanias shooed them away, slamming the door behind them. Kevin walked off with Walgrave, whispering, "What does it mean? Is it about Daenerys Targaryen?" Walgrave only patted Kevin's shoulder and told him to keep his silence. He knew it was about Daenerys, and he suspected Hanias was afraid. That fear might drive the Archmaester to do something drastic, like destroying the scroll or forging a narrative of his own. Walgrave felt torn. The Citadel's vow demanded loyalty, but his conscience pricked him. Perhaps Daenerys Targaryen deserved to know that a prophecy hidden in Oldtown spoke of her. Then again, could the knowledge nudge her toward a path of conquest and devastation? Was it better left buried? He could find no easy answer. Weeks later, rumors crackled through the city of Oldtown like wildfire. Daenerys Targaryen's forces had sailed south along the coast. Then ravens arrived confirming that a fleet had landed near the Shield Islands. The rumors varied wildly. Some claimed her armies had thousands of Dothraki screamers, others that her Unsullied marched in perfect formation. Above all, folk trembled at the possibility of dragons filling the sky. Every day, crowds gathered at the Oldtown docks, scanning the horizon. The Citadel was no different. Tension reigned in the libraries and dining halls, novices and maesters alike whispering about the Targaryen queen's next move. One evening, Walgrave stood atop a narrow parapet near the top of the Citadel, gazing out to sea. He watched the last vestiges of sunset fade into deep twilight, the sky turning purple and star-flecked. His bones felt cold, even under his thick cloak. 1,000 thoughts roiled in his mind. Then a sharp flapping of wings broke the quiet. A raven landed on the stone ledge, bearing a message tube. Walgrave coaxed the raven onto his wrist and retrieved the note. By moonlight, he read words scribbled in haste. High tower watchers see flickers of fire on the horizon. Ships with black and red sails approach. The Targaryen sigil is spotted. We await dawn. There it was spelled out, Daenerys Targaryen had come. The swirl of prophecy was no longer academic. It was real, immediate, pressing itself upon Oldtown's doorstep. Walgrave's heart pounded. He thought of the line that Hanias had repeated, "She will come to the high tower by flame." The high tower rose proudly above the harbor, a beacon for mariners. Soon it might be ringed by dragonfire. Who would stand, who would flee, and how would it all end? Throughout the night, Oldtown's populace stirred in mounting dread. Some boarded ships to flee up the Mander, seeking refuge inland. Others locked themselves in their homes. Merchants moved to secure their valuables. The lords of House Hightower prepared their defenses. The citadel itself seemed to hold its breath. At dawn, the city awoke to the sound of horns along the harbor walls. From the citadel's balconies and windows, maesters and novices looked out over the water. There, a fleet unfurled black sails emblazoned with the three-headed dragon. Sunlight glanced off warships. The tension was a living thing. Walgrave joined a crowd of maesters to watch from atop one of the towers. Archmaester Hanias was there, pale-faced and grim. The city's bells clanged ominously, a low peal that throbbed in the chest. The Targaryen fleet anchored at a cautious distance, as if waiting to see if Oldtown would open its gates or bristle with arrows. Then, overhead, a shadow passed across the sky, followed by a thunderous roar. A dragon's sword. It was massive, black and crimson, with wings that seemed to blot out the sun. Upon its back, a small figure clung, silver hair streaming behind. Daenerys Targaryen, the Dragon Queen, had arrived at Oldtown. Screams rose from the docks. Some men fell to their knees. Others ran. The dragon circled the high tower once, a menacing silhouette against the morning light. Walgrave felt a mixture of awe and terror. He'd heard stories all his life, read accounts of Aegon the Conqueror and his sisters astride dragons, but to see it in person made his knees weak. Flames licked out of the creature's maw, casting a searing glow. The prophecy was being fulfilled at this very moment, and Walgrave was powerless to do anything but bear witness. The lords of House Hightower, swathed in armor, formed ranks along the walls, uncertain whether to shoot scorpions at the beast overhead. But a single miscalculated arrow would bring fiery wrath upon the city. The people of Oldtown could only watch as Daenerys circled again, sending a gust of wind through the harbor. Then the dragon descended, alighting on a broad quay with a jarring thud that sent echoes through the water. Troops hurried forward. Unsullied in phalanx formation, Dothraki riders with their curved araks, some Westerosi bannermen who had pledged to the Dragon Queen. Oldtown's small garrison looked puny by comparison, uncertain whether to fight or stand down. From the vantage of the Citadel Tower, Walgrave's eyes strained to see her. Daenerys Targaryen dismounted gracefully. Even from a distance, her figure was unmistakable. Slender, clad in dark leathers with that silvery hair, Men parted around her as she advanced, flanked by advisors. Then a hush fell over Oldtown's docks, broken only by the crackle of torches and the distant drone of the bells. Hanias and the other archmasters looked grim, as if awaiting doom. Time seemed to slow. Walgrave's heart hammered. Any moment, he expected fire to rain from the dragon's jaws. Instead, Daenerys raised an arm, beckoning a group forward. It took Walgrave a moment to realize that they were envoys from House Hightower, wearing the beacon sigil. They approached with cautious steps. None knelt. The hush made the city feel suspended between two heartbeats. What words they exchanged, Walgrave could only guess. Demands of surrender or perhaps a negotiation. Daenerys was rumored to have a penchant for mercy, but she was also rumored to be uncompromising when faced with stubborn opposition. Walgrave pictured the hidden prophecy locked away in the citadel. Was it truly unstoppable fate that had brought her here? Was she compelled by some cosmic design, or by her own will? Suddenly, the dragon roared. A spurt of flame shot skyward. The crowd scattered in alarm, though no one was scorched. It seemed a warning or a display of power. Daenerys never flinched, still as carved marble. Then, after another tense pause, House Hightower's envoys slowly bent the knee. A collective gasp rippled through Oldtown. The watchers in the citadel exhaled. The envoys had yielded. For the moment, the city would not be burned. Under watchful eyes, Daenerys and her retinue marched into Oldtown streets. People peered from windows and doorways as the queen passed. Some cheered, others watched in fearful silence. That day, the conqueror's foot touched the soil of the realm's oldest city. Walgrave had to remind himself to breathe. It all felt surreal. That evening, word spread that the Hightowers had agreed to offer provisions and safe passage for Daenerys' army, in exchange for sparing the city. The Targaryen queen would be a guest in the Hightower itself, to parley with the local lords. Rumor had it she intended to spend only a few days there before moving north, aiming to solidify her claim to the Iron Throne once and for all. Walgrave's head spun with the realization. She was inside the city's walls, the living embodiment of the prophecy that had lain hidden in the citadel's vaults. Every fiber of his being urged him to do something, to speak to her, to tell her what he knew. But Hanias and the archmasters had locked away the text, sworn the novices to secrecy, and threatened dire consequences for any who revealed it. Still, Walgrave could not help himself. That night, he wrote a letter, a short missive addressed to Her Grace, Daenerys Targaryen. In it, he spoke only in oblique hints. A prophecy rests in these halls, mentioning a dragon queen and the fires of world's end. It has long been kept hidden. I fear it may portend both salvation and doom. If you wish to know more, seek me in the citadel. He signed it, an old man with knowledge. He debated for a long time whether to send it. Fear warred with curiosity. At last, driven by the sense that she deserved to know, he sealed the parchment and carefully handed it to Kevin, instructing him to deliver it discreetly to the queen's retinue. The next day dawned bleak and overcast, the sky a canvas of steel-gray clouds. Walgrave went about his tasks with a fluttering in his stomach, half expecting Hanias's men to storm in and drag him off for treason. By midday, no word came. By dusk, still no sign. Daenerys Targaryen remained inside the Hightower, conferring with the lords who had once served the Tyrells, attempting to win them over, so rumor said. She spoke of a new era, of breaking the wheel, of unshackling the realm from tyranny. Many were charmed. Some doubted. Meanwhile, Walgrave's letter seemed lost in the swirl of politics. That night, Walgrave managed to slip away from the citadel. Cloaked and hooded, he made his way through the winding streets of Oldtown. He passed taverns where men sang raucous songs, ignoring the presence of a dragon queen in their midst. He passed shuttered shops and beggars huddled in doorways. The Hightower soared above them all, a colossal edifice of stone and pride. Lantern light glimmered from its narrow windows. Guards at the gate asked his purpose. Walgrave declared himself a maester of the citadel on official business. They glanced at one another doubtfully, but his chain lent him an air of authority. After some hesitation, they allowed him within. Inside, the halls were lit by torches. Servants scurried past, carrying trays of wine and platters of roasted fish. He glimpsed unsullied guards standing sentinel at strategic points, implacable behind their spears. Walgrave's heart beat faster. Each step echoed in the corridor, carrying him deeper into the stronghold. He had no plan. He only knew he must try to speak to the queen, or at least one of her advisors, someone who would hear of the prophecy. He tried to project calm as he approached a double door leading to what he assumed was a receiving hall. Suddenly, a tall, lean figure stepped into his path. It was a knight in black armor, with cloak pinned by a three-headed dragon brooch. The knight's face was stern but not unkind. "The queen is not receiving visitors," he said. "Name your purpose." Walgrave stood straighter. I am Maester Walgrave from the Citadel. I have written a letter. Well, I never received a reply and The queen has no time for spurious appeals," the knight said. "If you have official business, it should go through her hand, or her master of whisperers, or the steward assigned to foreign audiences." Walgrave's throat constricted. He realized how foolish this was. He was just a trembling old man, not some important envoy. But the knight's momentary hesitation gave him courage to speak. "It concerns a prophecy kept hidden by the Citadel, a prophecy about her grace. I suspect she might want to hear of it." The knight stared in silence for a moment, as if weighing the maester's sincerity. At last, the tension in his shoulders softened. "Wait here," he said, then disappeared into the hall. Minutes passed. Walgrave shuffled his feet, feeling the weight of centuries in these ancient halls. He thought of the great maesters of old, men who had advised Targaryen kings. Would they have scorned him for meddling in prophecy? Likely so. In the Citadel, prophecy was often deemed an unreliable pursuit, better suited to shadowbinders and red priests. Eventually, the knight returned, ushering Walgrave inside. The receiving hall was modest compared to the lavish courts in King's Landing, but it was grand enough for Oldtown. Tapestries depicting House Hightower's sigil adorned the walls. A tall dais loomed at the far side, and upon it stood Daenerys Targaryen, conferring with a slender woman who wore a braided hairstyle reminiscent of Dothraki custom. The queen, so often described in rumor, was real and radiant. Her hair shone like moonlight. Her posture exuded command. Walgrave's throat felt dry as he approached, old knees shaking. He bowed low. "Your Grace," he managed, voice quivering. "I am Maester Walgrave, though no Archmaester am I. Forgive me for intruding." Daenerys regarded him with cool curiosity. "They say you bring talk of prophecy." Her voice was calm, measured. Her accent still carried the faintest trace of Essos, though her high Valyrian was said to be flawless. Walgrave glanced around. The slender Dothraki woman, perhaps a translator or advisor, studied him. The knight who had escorted him in stood near the door, arms folded. No other lords were present, nor any sign of the great and powerful men who might have sneered at mention of prophecy. This was private. Perhaps that was best. "Yes," Walgrave said softly. "The Citadel has in its vaults a fragment of an ancient scroll, said to be from the time shortly after the doom of Valyria. It speaks of a Targaryen queen who would be reborn at world's end, who would command dragons as the old empire once did. It has been kept hidden, locked away. The Citadel prefers not to speak of such matters, for fear of shaping events." Daenerys inclined her head. "And why do you speak of it now, if your order forbids it?" Walgrave swallowed. "Because I believe knowledge should not be hoarded. If this prophecy truly speaks of you, and I believe it does, you deserve to know its words. The lines foretell both salvation and destruction. The city of Oldtown was rumored to be engulfed by dragonflame in its final verse. I fear the Citadel has used that threat as reason enough to keep the prophecy sealed. They worry that revealing it might encourage the Targaryens to fulfill it." She studied him, eyes like pale amethysts. "And do you believe that foretelling destruction ensures it must come to pass?" He shook his head. "I do not, Your Grace, but I also know that men fear prophecy. It's unpredictable, and knowledge can be a weapon, or a guide, or both." My desire is simply that you understand what has been written. It speaks of a queen who shall burn away the old shackles, forging new bonds in fire. It claims the city of scholars shall kneel or burn, though which path is chosen depends on the queen herself. Daenerys's expression flickered, something between resolve and sorrow. I have no wish to destroy Oldtown, nor do I desire to force men to kneel if they can see reason. Yet the world does not bend easily. Sometimes, fire is necessary. Her gaze lifted to the tapestries, perhaps imagining how fragile such fineries might be in a dragon's path. This prophecy, it might just be words scrawled by men long dead, or it could be truth. Either way, I have come to break tyrants, not to become one. Walgrave felt a cautious relief. Then you have nothing to fear from the prophecy, or to enact it. I only wanted you to know that it exists, hidden by those who fear its power. A voice from the corner spoke up. It was the tall knight, quietly stepping forward. Your Grace, sometimes knowledge of a prophecy drives men, and women, to interpret it as a mandate. I have seen how illusions of destiny can warp good people. Let us not be ruled by old words. Daenerys nodded. I have walked through fire and paid the price for freedom. If a prophecy claims to foresee a path of ruin, I will not choose it merely because it is written. If it claims I am savior, I will not rely on that either. My own deeds must be my testament. Walgrave stood silently, heart pounding. She seemed so certain, so alive. This was the living breath behind the myths of Targaryen conquest. He realized tears had gathered at the corners of his eyes, for reasons he could not name. Perhaps it was relief that if the city burned, it would not be through blind acceptance of fate, but conscious choice. Perhaps it was awe at the presence of a woman who had walked out of a pyre with dragons at her side. Daenerys's gaze flicked back to him. I thank you for your honesty, Maester Walgrave. It was a risk to come here. You may remain in Oldtown unharmed under my protection, or return to the Citadel if you wish. I will not force your hand. He bowed again, trembling. You are gracious, your grace. I think I must return. The Citadel will not look kindly on my visit, but I have duties there. If events allow, I would gladly share with you the entire text. I only have fragments memorized, and the rest is kept under lock and key by Archmaester Hanias. A slight smile curved her lips. I suspect the Citadel has locked away other truths as well. We shall see if they are ready to share knowledge. For now, go in peace. The day may come when I visit the Citadel itself. He winced, picturing Hanias's face if that were to happen. But he nodded, bowed a final time, and let the knight escort him out. Walking through the corridors, he felt both lighter and heavier. He had done what he felt was right, but he had surely made an enemy of Hanias. The next days were a blur. Daenerys Targaryen remained in Oldtown, meeting with maesters who wished to advise her, hearing pleas from common folk, ensuring the city's stability under her presence. Reports arrived that Euron Greyjoy's fleet was still harrying the coast to the west, that Lannister holdouts in the Reach might rally. Yet the unstoppable force of the Targaryen alliance seemed to grow. People whispered that she might march north soon to unify the realm. The prophecy about the Hightower's destruction lingered in the back of Walgrave's mind, but so far no flames rose against Oldtown's spires. One evening, Walgrave found himself summoned once more by Archmaester Hanias. The older man was practically shaking with fury. How dare you speak to the Targaryen woman? He hissed through clenched teeth. Your betrayal puts the Citadel at risk. Prophecy is not knowledge, it is corruption. Superstition. We are men of reason. Walgrave tried to keep his voice calm. We are men who record truth. The Targaryen queen is real. Her dragons are real. Why cower from the knowledge that was locked away? If the prophecy has no power, why hide it? Hanias's knuckles went white where he gripped his desk. There are things the world is not meant to see. The Citadel's duty is to guard the realm from folly. We must not let a Targaryen queen shape her ambitions around archaic ravings. Walgrave took a shaky breath. If you fear that knowledge leads to ambition, then you fear the queen's character is flawed. Perhaps it is not the prophecy that would push her to tyranny, but your secrecy that might. Knowledge withheld tends to fester. Spare me your platitudes, Hania spat. The citadel stands for reason. You have forced my hand. He reached under his desk and lifted a small iron lockbox. The original scroll is inside this box. As of tonight, it no longer exists. With that, he produced a key and twisted it, opening the box. Within lay the aged parchment, edges so brittle they looked ready to crumble. Hania's no. Walgrave's plea died as the Archmaester withdrew a small pot of thick black liquid. Oil, or perhaps lamp oil laced with something more potent. Hania's brushed it over the scroll, drenching the prophecy's lettering. Then, in one swift motion, he took a candle flame to it. Fire spread instantly, devouring the old parchment in a wave of orange heat. A gout of foul-smelling smoke rose to the ceiling. Walgrave let out a strangled cry, instinctively stepping forward, but it was too late. The ancient scroll curled, blackened, and disintegrated in moments, leaving only ashes. The prophecy was gone, destroyed. Walgrave stared, wide-eyed, as Hanias slammed the box shut. "You fool," Walgrave whispered. "This was our heritage, a piece of knowledge from the dawn of Targaryen might. You burned it as if it was worthless." Hanias's face was set in stony resolve. "Better worthless than dangerous. Now you will keep silent or you will share the same fate." "Do I make myself clear?" Walgrave could barely find his voice. "Archmaester, what have you done?" "What had to be done?" Hanias snapped. "You want the realm to drown in illusions of destiny? I will not allow it." Walgrave stormed out, tears burning his eyes. By the time he reached his chamber, fury warred with heartbreak. The prophecy's original text was destroyed. All that remained were his notes, a few references in other volumes, and Daenerys Targaryen's partial knowledge. One could argue that Hanias had removed a weapon from the queen's arsenal. But Walgrave felt an acute sense of loss. The realm's history, once recorded, was meant to be preserved, not annihilated. He collapsed onto his bed, mind spinning with guilt and confusion. Had he done the right thing by revealing the prophecy to Daenerys? Was Hanias correct that prophecy only sowed chaos? He barely slept that night, haunted by the memory of the flaming scroll. At dawn, he learned that Daenerys Targaryen was departing Oldtown. Her fleet would sail north within the week. He heard no direct summons from her. Perhaps she was satisfied with what she knew. Perhaps she intended to let the Citadel keep its secrecy, so long as they did not oppose her. Or perhaps she already sensed that the original text was destroyed. The city's mood was strangely relieved. Many had feared a sacking or an abrupt show of dragonfire, but none of that came to pass. Instead, the Dragon Queen had taken supplies, paid for with gold, it was said, and left an official behind to manage relations. House Hightower bent the knee, receiving mercy rather than flame. No one knew what would happen in the wars to come, but for now, Oldtown remained unscathed. A day before her departure, Walgrave ventured once more to the docks, hoping to catch some sign of her. He found only the churn of water around the Targaryen fleet. Soldiers loaded crates of grain and barrels of fresh water. Dothraki eyed the city's architecture with bemusement, not used to such towering stone structures. The great black dragon soared overhead, occasionally diving into the sea to snatch an unlucky fish. There was no sign of the queen. Walgrave turned to leave, his heart heavy. But as he slipped through the throng, he felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see the slender Dothraki woman who had been by Daenerys' side in the receiving hall. Her hair was braided with small bells that tinkled softly. She looked him up and down, then pressed a small scroll into his hand. "For you," she said in the common tongue, her accent thick but intelligible. "Khaleesi said to give this to the maester who brought knowledge." Then she turned and disappeared among the crowd. Walgrave stood there, tingling with curiosity. He opened the small scroll. The words, scrawled in a neat, flowing hand, read, "Maester Walgrave, I regret that I cannot meet with you again before my departure. If there is indeed a prophecy about my reign, I thank you for bringing it to my attention, and I hope your citadel will not punish you for your honesty. But know this, my destiny is my own. Whatever path I choose, I will not bow to an ancient text. I am grateful for your courage in speaking truth. Should the day come when I sit the Iron Throne, I pray you will be there to aid our realm in wisdom. May we meet again in a freer world. Daenerys of House Targaryen. Walgrave held the scroll to his chest, tears threatening once more. For all the fear swirling in him, for all the confusion about prophecy, the queen's words felt like a gentle salve. In that moment, he felt a strange certainty that her conquest, whether heralded by ancient scrolls or not, might be more than just another war. Something new was taking shape, a break from the old cycles of vengeance and tyranny. He returned to the citadel that evening, the letter hidden safely in his robe. Hanias glowered at him across the dining hall, but said nothing. The old man had done his worst by burning the prophecy. Yet words can burn, and ideas can vanish from parchment, but they live on in minds and hearts. Walgrave still recalled fragments of the text, the references to World's End and the Queen Reborn. He recalled the lines about the final choice that would define an age. Perhaps Daenerys Targaryen's future was not a matter of stale prophecy. Perhaps she would define it herself. In the weeks that followed, tales of the Dragon Queen's campaigns began trickling in. She moved north, forging alliances, confronting the last pockets of Lannister resistance, and uniting houses under her banner. Some fought her tooth and nail, others accepted her. All the while, Walgrave busied himself in the citadel, silently enduring Hanias's cold hostility. Yet there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere among some of the younger maesters and novices. They whispered that Daenerys Targaryen might not be just another pretender. She was said to have dragons, yes, but also a desire to break the old ways. Some novices even confided in Walgrave, asking shyly if the prophecy was true, that she was the chosen conqueror from a lost age. Walgrave told them gently, "The prophecy was real, but it has been destroyed. The queen you see is the queen she chooses to be." Time marched on. Battles raged far away, beyond Oldtown's horizon. The city remained intact, no flames licking its famed tower. Daenerys had her eyes set on King's Landing, so rumor said. Walgrave occasionally found himself approached by travelers in the city's markets. An exiled noble from the Crownlands, a hedge knight from the Reach, asking if the rumors of a prophesied queen were true. He gave them the same even answer, perhaps, yet prophecy alone changes nothing. Look to her deeds. Late one night, Walgrave sat in his chamber reading a letter from a maester traveling with the Targaryen host, a younger man named Ferrys, who had pledged fealty to Daenerys and offered her counsel. Ferrys described how Daenerys, upon taking a castle, was more merciful than the lords who had preceded her. He told of her methods of justice, her attempts to avoid unnecessary slaughter, though at times the dragons had to show their might. The letter ended with a note of triumph. She stands upon the precipice of victory, uniting houses that have warred for centuries. If the final strongholds surrender, we may see a new dawn. Walgrave sighed, setting the letter aside. His gaze wandered over to the hidden shelf in his room. He had meticulously written down all he remembered of the prophecy, scrawling it in code so Hanias would not recognize it. He did not know if it would ever matter again, but part of him refused to let it vanish from the world entirely. He knew it might be dangerous, but knowledge was always a risk. He could almost hear the ancient words echo in his head. She shall be reborn at the edge of the world's ruin, pale as starlight, bearing flame to break chains and conquer thrones. By her hand shall the old city kneel or burn. In her wake, the sorrow of bells, the thunder of hooves, and a new realm rising from ash. How close that came to describing what he had witnessed. Yet Daenerys Targaryen was not a puppet dancing on prophecy strings. She was a living woman, forging her own path, shaped by what she believed was right or necessary. In the Citadel's long history, knowledge had been a double-edged sword. Some tried to bury it, some tried to wield it like a blade. Perhaps neither approach was wholly wise. Knowledge was best served by open discourse, tempered by reason. That was what Walgrave had always believed, though it had cost him dearly. As time wore on and Daenerys Targaryen's conquest neared its conclusion, men asked again, was her triumph foretold by an ancient prophecy? Did the scroll speak of her specifically, or was it just another of the realm's many doomsday warnings? The truth was that no scroll could truly predict the shape of a human heart, nor the will and determination of a solitary soul. Daenerys's victories, her forging alliances, toppling tyrants, stemmed as much from her personal experiences and convictions as from any ancient words scrawled on a brittle parchment. Yet from Oldtown's perspective, even if some parts of the prophecy had indeed come true, the city stood unburnt. The high tower had not crumbled into the harbor. The maesters had not been consumed in dragon flame. Instead, they found themselves part of a realm that was changing, perhaps for the better. And in that change lay the deeper mystery of prophecy. It might highlight a path, but it is the choices of the living that determine the final outcome. Walgrave, well past his 8th decade, felt an unaccustomed flicker of hope. Maybe the realm could endure a Targaryen queen, one who did not enslave, but freed the enslaved. One who had no interest in slaughtering knowledge, but in expanding it. He had seen her stand in Oldtown's harbor, a queen of flesh and blood, not just a phantom from a scroll. He had heard the roar of her dragon, but also the kindness in her words. Even so, among the novices and younger maesters, rumors persisted that the Citadel had once harbored a prophecy which might have changed the course of history if only it had been shared. Some believed it was best that the prophecy was gone, allowing events to unfold naturally. Others mourned the loss as a crime against knowledge. Walgrave heard these discussions from the edges of the library, never quite joining in. He had become something of a cautious figure, a living testament to the conflict between truth and secrecy. Late on the eve of Daenerys' final triumph, news said King's Landing had surrendered. Walgrave wandered through the Citadel's great library, trailing his fingertips along the spines of countless books. With the Targaryen queen's ascension, would the Citadel remain aloof, or would it join in forging a new era? Many archmaesters, Hania's included, still mistrusted her. Yet one could not deny that knowledge would be vital in rebuilding a fractured realm. Daenerys would need advisors who understood medicine, agriculture, Raventry, histories, laws, and all the myriad subjects the Citadel specialized in. Near a dusty corner, Walgrave paused before a shelf of old genealogies. Tucked there, behind a row of volumes, he spotted something that made his heart jump. An old scrap of parchment, half-burned, with scorched edges. Carefully, he lifted it out. It bore a few lines in that archaic High Valyrian script. He recognized it immediately as part of the destroyed scroll. Perhaps it had been torn off before Hania's final conflagration. Though most of the text was ruined, a single line remained legible. Born of storm and salt, crowned by flame, the breaker of iron. Tears welled in Walgrave's eyes. The prophecy refused to vanish entirely. Some shard of it had survived. He pressed the parchment to his chest, remembering Daenerys Targaryen's calm conviction, the warmth in her voice when she spoke of freedom, the flash of her dragons overhead. Was her conquest heralded by an ancient prophecy kept hidden in Oldtown? Yes and no. The prophecy existed, but it did not define her. She defined it by living, by choosing, by forging alliances, by offering mercy where she could. Perhaps the text had predicted one version of events, but the future had always belonged to living wills, not dead words. Softly, he whispered to the parchment, "You remain, enough to be a reminder of what we should not hide. Perhaps that will be enough." He thought of passing it to the younger maesters, letting them see for themselves how knowledge can be endangered by fear. Or maybe he would keep it safe until the day Daenerys herself might return to Oldtown. He pictured leading her through the echoing halls of the Citadel, letting her see that prophecy was but a shard of history, incomplete and vulnerable as everything else in the world. Knowledge could guide, but it could also mislead if taken as destiny. In the final hours before dawn, Walgrave returned to his small chamber. He lit a candle, set the scrap of parchment beside his coded notes, and took a quill in hand. Methodically, he copied the surviving line onto a fresh sheet, preserving it for posterity. Then, with the patient care of an old scholar, he translated the text into the common tongue, writing beneath the high Valyrian, "Born of storm and salt, crowned by flame, the breaker of iron." He paused, letting the words linger. "Daenerys Stormborn," he mused, "the breaker of chains." He set down his quill and stared at the flickering candlelight. Beyond these walls, the realm was changing, perhaps for good or ill. But if the prophecy had indeed heralded her rise, then the realm now had a queen tempered by trials no scroll could fully capture. Maybe that was the real meaning. Not that prophecy would dictate her every step, but that the hope of dragons had never truly died. The rest, the salvation or destruction, lay with her choices. As exhaustion claimed him, Walgrave dozed in his chair. In his dream, he imagined Daenerys Targaryen standing in a courtyard lit by morning sun. Behind her, a dragon's silhouette loomed, majestic and ominous. She reached out a hand, not to strike him with flame, but to lift him up and show him a vision of the future. A land united, if only for a time, by the belief that chains could be broken and cruelty answered. In the dream, he felt both terror at the dragon's heat and wonder at the promise in the queen's eyes. When he awoke, the candle was nearly spent, a puddle of wax on the desk. The city outside stirred with the earliest morning sounds. Gulls crying over the harbor, distant footsteps of novices beginning their chores, and somewhere far away, the bells of the high tower marking a new day. Walgrave inhaled, setting the parchment carefully in a leather pouch. He might not live to see the final outcome of Daenerys' conquest, but he believed he had witnessed the dawn of a new chapter in Westeros. The prophecy, for what it was worth, had played its part. The rest would be written by men and women in the days ahead. In time, they might say of Daenerys Stormborn that she fulfilled an ancient vow woven into Valyria's last scion. They might say her coming was carved into the stones of Oldtown's vaults, or that the signs were there for those who dared to look. Or they might say the prophecy was nothing but dust and words, and that the Dragon Queen's triumph was of her own making. Walgrave suspected the truth lay somewhere in between. Prophecies can cast a guiding shadow across the stage, but it is the players who decide how the play must end. For now, the aged maester contented himself with a small secret, that the Citadel, in its labyrinth of knowledge, had once held a prophecy so startling and so close to the truth. And though official records might claim it never existed, though Hanias might brand him a traitor for believing in it, Walgrave knew. He had seen it, read it, shared it in hushed tones with the Queen herself. And the Queen had chosen to be more than the prophecy. She had chosen to lead in a way that gave the realm a chance, at least for a while, at peace. That was all that truly mattered. As the quiet morning light spread across the Citadel's stones, Walgrave allowed himself a thin, tired smile. The realm would debate for generations. Was Daenerys' conquest heralded by that ancient prophecy hidden in Oldtown? Or was it pure happenstance, shaped by her own relentless spirit? He suspected that one day historians would argue over the ashes of the prophecy, glimpses of it reappearing in obscure references. Tales would grow, versions would change, and in the end, only one truth remained. A Dragon Queen had indeed come, with flame and blood, but also with ideals of freedom. Regardless of what was written in musty scrolls, the legacy of Daenerys Targaryen would stand on its own, and that legacy, for good or ill, would outlive them all. Walgrave woke to the far-off clamor of city sounds mingling with gull cries, the dawn light bleeding across the curved stones of his chamber. His eyes focused on the desk where he had fallen asleep, the tallow candle stub having melted into a smeared pool of wax. The scrap of parchment he had rescued from Hanias's flame sat beside his leather-bound notes, as though it were a silent guardian of everything he feared and everything he hoped. For a moment, the old maester wondered if the prior day's encounters had been a dream, but the ache in his neck and the faint traces of ash on his fingertips told him it was all too real. Daenerys Targaryen had stood in Oldtown's harbor with her dragon, the Citadel had witnessed it, and Hanias had burned the ancient prophecy to cinders. Yet the realm moved on as it always did. He stood slowly, stretching bones that felt older each morning, then slipped the scrap of prophecy into a pouch. He tied the pouch around his waist beneath his maester's robe. No one would see it. Hanias would not suspect him of holding any relic of that dreaded scroll. Knowledge was to be preserved, Walgrave reminded himself, though it weighed on him that preserving it might cost him his place if it were discovered. In the corridor, novices bustled, carrying trays of bread and watered wine for the morning meal. One of them paused to nod respectfully at Walgrave, no doubt noticing how stooped he seemed, but Walgrave managed a thin smile and continued on his way. There was a subdued hush in the citadel that day. Even novices who preferred idle gossip seemed subdued by the new reality of a Targaryen queen in Westeros, one who had come in peace, relatively speaking, and departed with fewer casualties than many had feared. Walgrave sat on a bench near the courtyard garden, silently waiting for word of Daenerys' next move. He half expected Archmaester Hanias or his cronies to appear at any moment and accuse him of treason. But no one arrived. Only the usual patter of novices tending to the garden greeted him, while above, thick clouds suggested an afternoon rainstorm. Finally, a thin, sharp-faced maester named Corton emerged, brandishing a sheaf of messages. "You've heard the news?" Corton asked, lips pursed. He looked unsettled. "Ravens arrived this morning. The Targaryen fleet has sailed toward the Mander's Mouth. Some watchers claim they'll move up the river, striking inland, or perhaps circle Dorne if the roads prove unwelcoming. Reports are conflicting." Walgrave nodded. "She has reason to hurry, I expect. Lannister holdouts remain. There might be Greyjoy raiders about as well." Corton glanced around, as though someone might be listening. "They say House Hightower accepted her terms. The city is intact, as you can see. But the Archmaesters are in a fury. They fear a Targaryen presence might overshadow the Citadel's authority. There's talk of restricting novices from discussing her name." He gave Walgrave a meaningful look. "I suspect your conversation with the Queen didn't go unnoticed." Walgrave rubbed the back of his neck, feeling that deep tension that rarely left him now. "Let them restrict. She's here whether we name her or not. Words alone cannot banish the truth." Corton almost cracked a rueful grin but thought better of it. He tapped his sheaf of messages. "Some of these are for you. Requests from outlying lords who want genealogical confirmations or claim to have discovered old manuscripts. I'll have them delivered to your chamber." Walgrave thanked him softly and was left alone in the garden once more. A breeze stirred the leaves, bringing with it the faint smell of the Honeywine River. Daenerys was gone, but her shadow lingered in Oldtown's corners. He could feel it in the watchfulness of the guards near the docks, in the hush among the novices. For so long, the citadel had stood as a fortress of knowledge in a realm shaped by warring kings. Now, perhaps for the first time in generations, that fortress of knowledge had to contend with a Targaryen who seemed genuinely determined to reshape the realm. And though the original prophecy scroll was ash, Walgrave still held its echoes in his heart. He found himself thinking of the Queen's words, "My destiny is my own." Even if she believed that wholeheartedly, it did not mean the realm would accept it so easily. How many lords would see her as a threat to their power? How many would cling to old hatreds of the Targaryen name? The prophecy might have predicted destruction or salvation, but in Walgrave's eyes, the greatest question was whether Daenerys could unite the realm without repeating the sins of her ancestors. Or would the realm reject her, forcing her hand toward fire and blood? That afternoon, rain swept in from the sea. Walgrave retreated to his chamber and shut the door. He took up the scrap again, the half-burned line glimmering in the lamplight. Born of storm and salt, crowned by flame, the breaker of iron. He recognized the reference to Daenerys' birth during a storm on Dragonstone, and the salty ocean that had surrounded that island fortress. The phrase "crowned by flame" once seemed so literal, when she had stepped into Drogo's funeral pyre and emerged with living dragons. And breaker of iron surely referred to her destruction of chains, both figuratively in Slaver's Bay and literally with her symbol of the broken manacles. Prophecies, it seemed, had a cunning way of weaving truth with metaphor. A knock on his door startled him. Hastily, Walgrave tucked the parchment away and opened the door a crack, half expecting Hanias. Instead, Kevin the novice stood there, carrying a small satchel. "More letters arrived, Maester," the boy said. "I was asked to bring them at once." Walgrave opened the door wider and motioned Kevin to enter. The novice set the satchel on the small table near the window. He had grown a bit taller in the past months, though his face still betrayed a boyish nervousness. He glanced around the chamber, eyes full of curiosity. "They say the Queen left 2 days ago. Do you think she'll return soon?" Walgrave shrugged. "She has business north of here. King's Landing awaits, no doubt. Possibly other alliances. She may come back someday, yes. Or not. Her path is uncertain." Kevin's shoulders slumped. "I missed my chance to see the dragons. I was too frightened to go out onto the quay." Walgrave felt a tender sympathy. "You'll see them one day if you live long enough. Those creatures do not vanish easily." Kevin grimaced, then hesitated. "There's a rumor among the novices that you had words with her. Is it true?" For an instant, Walgrave considered caution. But Kevin had proven his trustworthiness before. "Yes, briefly," he said in a low tone. "She was not what I expected. Different from the stories, more thoughtful." The boy brightened. "And the prophecy? People whisper about an ancient scroll that was destroyed." He looked suddenly fearful. "If you'd rather not say," Walgrave sighed. "It's best not to dwell on prophecy when the Archmasters have forbidden it. But yes, that rumor holds truth. The scroll is gone." Kevin swallowed hard, as though grappling with the magnitude of lost knowledge. Then, after a small bow, he left Walgrave alone once more. The old man rummaged through the newly arrived letters, a swirl of lesser tasks demanding attention. Yet his mind stayed fixated on Daenerys. He found himself imagining her on the deck of a ship, scanning the horizon for any sign of betrayal, or perhaps astride her dragon, Regal or Drogon, heading toward a new confrontation with the Lannisters. Whatever might be unfolding, the realm had no choice now but to reckon with the Dragon Queen. By the time supper arrived, a bland stew in the Citadel's refectory, Walgrave felt subdued. He ate slowly, ignoring the occasional suspicious glances from other maesters who still recalled that he had tried to bring the prophecy forward. Archmaester Hanias did not appear in the hall, which was a small mercy. Walgrave stared at the flickering torchlight as it danced across the high stone walls, thinking how this vast institution had stood for centuries, collecting knowledge from across continents. Yet in the face of one queen and her dragons, some of those same guardians of knowledge had turned to secrecy, to destruction of scrolls, rather than honest discourse. He wondered if the seven themselves lamented how men hoarded or obliterated wisdom. In the following weeks, the Citadel received countless ravens about Daenerys' advance. Some carried outlandish claims, that she commanded an army of the dead, or that her dragons could vanish into clouds, or that she had bewitched lords with unnatural beauty. More credible messages spoke of her forging a pact with certain lords of the Reach, ensuring they would not rise against her. Word came that large swathes of the Crownlands recognized her claim, though pockets of Lannister loyalists still resisted. King's Landing stood in uneasy anticipation. Cersei Lannister, once so formidable, had retreated behind the Red Keep's walls, rumored to be searching for any advantage. Alliances, caches of wildfire, sellswords from Essos. The city's inhabitants braced themselves for a siege that might burn them all. Walgrave naturally gleaned what details he could from the official dispatches. Late one evening, huddled in a dusty reading alcove, he read an account from a traveling Septon who had witnessed Daenerys' approach to the Rose Road. The Septon described a sight that made Walgrave's heart pound. A swarm of Dothraki riders, their war cries echoing over the plains, flanking the Queen's retinue of unsullied soldiers. 3 dragons soared overhead, occasionally alighting to hunt goats or cattle. Small folk in hamlets and villages found themselves both terrified and awestruck. Some knelt voluntarily, amazed by the presence of the breaker of chains. Others fled, fearing the wrath of fire. But so far, the Septon insisted, Daenerys had not sacked any major settlement. She took supplies with coin or with the promise of future restitution, always mindful that forced tribute bred hatred. Such deliberate caution told Walgrave that Daenerys was keenly aware of her precarious position. She could not afford to be seen as a monster. She likely knew that if she scorched the countryside, she would become the enemy of all. The prophecy might well have whispered of unstoppable flame, but Daenerys was forging her own path through diplomacy as much as warfare, something Walgrave found encouraging. Yet not everyone in Oldtown believed her approach was wise. Some maesters grumbled that eventually, a Targaryen shows their true colors. Others predicted that she would be lured into a battle from which she could not recover. Still others insisted her dragons were too few to control the entire continent. Walgrave listened silently, offering no opinion. If they had read the old prophecy, they might have gleaned that the success of this queen was not measured in numbers alone. But the prophecy was ashes as Hania's intended. Or so the Archmaester believed. A fortnight later, a more urgent raven arrived. The seat of House Tarly, Horn Hill, had declared for Daenerys after a tense standoff. The Tarleys were fierce warriors and had previously supported House Tyrell, then House Lannister for a time. Now, Lord Randall Tarly had been forced to bend the knee or face the fury of dragons. Word of his decision created waves in Oldtown, for the Tarleys were widely respected. If they had capitulated, then Daenerys's hold on the region was stronger than ever. The Citadel's maesters met in closed sessions to discuss the realm's shifting allegiances, uncertain how to advise House Hightower or the other southwestern lords who might be dithering. Walgrave heard rumors of tension between Archmaester Hanias and certain progressive-minded maesters who believed they should at least open channels with Daenerys's camp. But Hanias, predictably, insisted that the Citadel remain above the fray. Late that evening, Walgrave climbed to the Citadel's highest accessible balcony. From there, one could see the entire sprawl of Oldtown, the majestic high tower, and the dark line of sea beyond. Lanterns glimmered like scattered diamonds, and the soft hush of waves against the quay carried on the wind. He recalled the day Daenerys's dragon circled above that same harbor, flames licking the sky. Now, the city was quiet, its inhabitants uncertain if the Queen's departure meant permanent reprieve. Walgrave shut his eyes, letting the sea breeze brush his cheeks. He pictured Daenerys pressing on toward King's Landing, her mind filled with grand designs, perhaps haunted by the memory of her father's madness and determined not to follow in his footsteps. The prophecy, had it survived, might have urged her to burn Oldtown, to force the Citadel to kneel in terror. But she had chosen differently. A few days later, Walgrave was summoned by an unexpected visitor. The steward who managed the Citadel's main gate said a messenger from the Targaryen host had arrived, requesting to speak with the old maester who once wrote to the Queen. Startled, Walgrave hurried to the gatehouse. There he found a lean young man with silver-streaked hair, a Targaryen retainer of some sort. His clothing was practical, dusty from the road, and he carried the Queen's sigil upon a small banner strapped to his back. At the sight of Walgrave, the messenger bowed briefly. "Maester Walgrave, I have been instructed to deliver this." He offered a sealed letter. "Her Grace asks that you read it at once." Walgrave took the letter, heart fluttering, and glanced at the imposing shape of the steward. The steward's face was unreadable, though his posture suggested disapproval. Walgrave nodded to the messenger and said quietly, "You'll have safe lodging here tonight. The roads can be perilous after dark." The messenger thanked him, then disappeared to a side chamber with the steward. Walgrave, hands trembling, cracked the seal on the letter. The wax bore the imprint of the three-headed dragon. Inside was a neat script that he recognized as Daenerys's own. "Maester Walgrave, your words in Oldtown remain with me. I have marched across the Reach, forging alliances and quelling resistance. In each place, the people speak of the Citadel's knowledge. I believe that if I am to reign, I will need men of learning who can serve the realm, not in fear, but in truth. The Citadel, however, seems reluctant to respond to my overtures. Some say they hide knowledge of the Targaryens. Some say they fear dragons. I do not blame them, yet knowledge is vital. I write to invite you or any maester who shares your integrity to join me. We march soon on King's Landing." If the city opens its gates, I will spare its people. If not, a siege shall be upon them. Afterward, I plan to hold a great council to guide the realm's future. I wish for the citadel to have representation there, that all may see we are forging a realm built on wisdom and justice, not fear. If you can convince your superiors to send an envoy, I would welcome it. If they refuse, perhaps you yourself will come, should you feel safe traveling. I understand the risk you might take. Know that you have my gratitude and my protection if you choose to stand at my side. Daenerys of House Targaryen. Walgrave read the letter twice, a swirl of emotion passing through him. She wished for the Citadel's presence in her new order. It was a sensible request from a queen who recognized the power of knowledge. But how would Hanias react to that? The Archmaester would likely see it as an attempt to subjugate the Citadel or to control its voice. Yet Walgrave sensed sincerity in Daenerys's words. She did not want blind servants. She wanted advisors who might challenge her, offering reason. If her father had burned men alive for speaking against him, she sought to do the opposite, though that might prove a heavier burden than she realized. By the time Walgrave composed himself enough to move, the messenger had already been given a small room near the stables. Walgrave retreated to his chamber, reading the letter again by lamplight. He knew he had to present this invitation to the Citadel's Council of Archmaesters. They alone would decide if an official envoy was to be sent. Secretly, he suspected that Hanias would block any such attempt. But Walgrave felt compelled to try. Was it not the Citadel's duty to provide counsel to all who sought knowledge for the betterment of the realm? The next morning, he sought an audience with the council. In a high, windowless chamber lit by iron sconces, the Archmaesters convened around a broad table. Each wore robes signifying their areas of expertise, a ring of gold for medicine, a ring of silver for ravenry, iron for warcraft, and so on. Hanias, perched near the head of the table, wore a scowl that only deepened when Walgrave produced Daenerys's letter. Walgrave cleared his throat, hands shaking slightly, and read the queen's words aloud. When he finished, a murmur rippled around the room. Finally, Archmaester Raghan, known for his even temper, spoke. It is not unprecedented for Targaryen monarchs to invite the Citadel's council. Maester Gorman served Aegon the Conqueror in the earliest days, so the histories tell us. We've always sought to preserve knowledge across regimes. The question is whether to accept. A hawk-nosed Archmaester with a ring for politics added, if we refuse, we risk alienating her. And if she takes King's Landing, she may view our refusal as an insult. That could harm the Citadel's standing. Archmaester Hanias cleared his throat sharply. His gaze speared Walgrave, then circled the table. Her father also invited maesters, and we know how that ended, for some, with a pyre. This queen may posture about justice, but we cannot be certain. The rumors of her father's madness linger in that bloodline, and she brought Dothraki savages across the sea. We cannot forget the threat they pose. A few nods of agreement followed, but others remained unconvinced. Hanias pressed on. To send an envoy is to lend her legitimacy. It suggests we endorse her conquest, that we are complicit. Best we remain neutral. The Citadel has stood through countless wars, and we do not anoint victors. We record events, that is all. Walgrave swallowed. We can remain neutral as historians, but still respond to her invitation for counsel. She specifically seeks men of learning, which suggests she does not wish to rule in ignorance. Refusing could cause her to think we are against her. And let us not forget, she came to Oldtown and left it unburned. She had reason enough to threaten us, but she did not. Should we not at least attempt dialogue? Hanias glared. And risk unveiling every secret the Citadel keeps? Let her rule if she must. We remain as guardians of knowledge, not messengers to every would-be conqueror. Tension crackled in the room. After more debate, Raghan ventured a compromise. Perhaps we send one maester in an unofficial capacity, not as a formal endorsement but as an observer. That way we do not appear hostile, nor do we fully commit. It might appease the queen enough. Hanias scoffed. She requests an envoy. We send one man, she might take it as an insult. She specifically asked for the Citadel's voice, a seat at her great council. She wants more than just an observer. Walgrave raised a trembling hand. We can speak plainly to her. The Citadel does not pick sides, but we do advise on matters of scholarship and healing. If her rule is inevitable, better that we shape it for the good of the realm than remain silent. She might accept that stance. The council debated for another hour. Some archmasters remained firmly opposed. Others saw advantage in maintaining lines of communication. In the end, a narrow majority agreed to send an observer, but in the same breath they declared that this observer would have no authority to speak on behalf of the entire citadel. It was a half measure that satisfied almost no one. When Hanias pushed for who would be sent, Walgrave expected that they'd choose a younger, more malleable maester. To his astonishment, Raghan nominated Walgrave. "He has already established a rapport with the queen," Raghan said. "She requested him by name. Let him be the face of the citadel's caution, if nothing else." Walgrave's pulse jumped at the thought of leaving Oldtown, traveling into the heart of the Targaryen host. Yet a strange excitement flickered too. Perhaps this was his chance to do what was right. Hanias's lip curled, but the majority assented. "Very well," Hanias relented, voice thick with displeasure. "Let Maester Walgrave go if he chooses, but he speaks only for himself. Let that be recorded." Walgrave bowed stiffly. It was decided. He would represent the citadel in name only, with no official power. But it was better than nothing. The next day, Walgrave packed his modest belongings, including the coded notes of the prophecy and the half-burned scrap. He told no one but Kevin that he intended to keep these items with him, hidden in a hollow portion of his traveling trunk. The memory of Hanias's fury remained fresh. If that man discovered the fragments, Walgrave's life could be forfeit. But he refused to part with them. He had the uneasy sense that the day would come when Daenerys might wish to see whatever remnant existed of that prophecy. Perhaps reading it would help her avoid the darkest paths. On a drizzly morning, Walgrave departed Oldtown by carriage. A small retinue of city guards accompanied him to ensure safe travel up the Rose Road. House Hightower offered limited escort, more out of courtesy than real concern. After all, the Queen's armies patrolled much of the route. Walgrave felt a pang of sorrow leaving the citadel behind. He had spent the better part of his life within its walls, tending to manuscripts and novices. Now he left uncertain whether he would ever return. Some novices lined the courtyard to watch him depart. Kevin stood among them, eyes misty, but he offered Walgrave a determined nod. The old man raised a hand in farewell, then the carriage rumbled away. Outside Oldtown's gates, the early autumn sun struggled through the clouds, illuminating fields still green from recent rains. Farmers worked their plots, warily eyeing any travelers, for these were troubled times. Yet some sense of order persisted, perhaps because the Targaryen queen's forces had stifled widespread banditry. As the carriage rolled on, Walgrave peered through the window, recalling the old tales of Aegon's conquest and how he had marched along these very roads centuries ago. Now, a new Targaryen did much the same, but in a realm drastically changed. The first significant sign of Daenerys's presence came late on the second day of travel. Walgrave and his escort encountered a group of Unsullied stationed at a crossroads, their spears held at a disciplined angle. Their commander was a lean man with a whipcord build and calm eyes. He eyed Walgrave's carriage suspiciously until Walgrave announced himself as a maester of the citadel traveling under invitation. After verifying the letter's seal, the commander bowed and stepped aside. Walgrave marveled at their absolute control, their silent discipline, so unlike Westerosi soldiers who bellowed and cursed. Rumor said the Unsullied felt no fear, for their brutal training had stripped them of it. That alone was enough to make them formidable. Yet these men showed no immediate hostility, only caution. Walgrave wondered if they truly felt nothing beneath those stoic gazes. On the fourth day, the carriage neared Highgarden, the seat of House Tyrell, once the heart of the Reach, now under Targaryen control after the Lannisters had seized it and then lost it. Walgrave remembered hearing of the chaotic struggle, the Tyrells ousted by Lannister gold and cunning, only for Daenerys to descend upon the Lannister caravan and burn it to cinders on the plains. The Tyrell fortune was gone, scattered or stolen, and the once glorious castle had lost some of its luster. When Walgrave's retinue arrived, they found Targaryen banners flying from the ramparts, while Dothraki riders cantered about the outer fields, apparently enthralled by the lush farmland. Highgarden's gates stood open to travelers, though an unsullied guard at each post indicated that the castle was under tight control. A Targaryen officer in pale leathers greeted Walgrave, leading him through Highgarden's manicured courtyards. Despite the castle's recent trials, the famed rose gardens and fountains remained intact, if somewhat neglected. The sweet scent of autumn roses hung in the air. The officer explained that Daenerys had claimed Highgarden as a temporary seat of operations in the Reach. Most of the key battles were shifting east now, toward King's Landing, but a skeleton force remained here to maintain order. Walgrave was led into a side wing of the castle, where a gathering of newcomers had been quartered, lords who had bent the knee, envoys from various houses, and a few scribes, all waiting to be summoned for an audience with the queen. But the queen herself was not in the castle at present. She had moved on days ago, stationing her main camp closer to the capital. The officer apologized for any inconvenience, then left Walgrave to settle in. Alone in a small suite that smelled faintly of lavender, Walgrave felt a momentary pang of disappointment. He had hoped to deliver the Citadel's acceptance directly, but he consoled himself. The letter had said to join her near King's Landing. This was just a way station. He found a dusty desk, set his trunk down, and carefully extracted a quill and parchment. He scrawled notes on the day's journey, the disposition of Targaryen forces in Highgarden, and his impressions of the uneasy calm that had fallen over the region. Then he hid the half-burned prophecy scrap in a secret compartment behind the desk's drawers, not wanting to keep it in his trunk in case soldiers decided to rummage. That evening, Walgrave dined in a makeshift great hall with other travelers. The atmosphere was cautious but civil. He overheard conversations. Some minor lords grumbled that Daenerys demanded men swear fealty on threat of dragonfire. Others insisted she was far more merciful than the Lannisters had ever been. A merchant from the Arbor recounted how Daenerys's forces had paid generously for casks of wine, not plundering them as many had feared. The rumor that the Tyrell gold was stolen away to King's Landing lingered as well. Walgrave listened, gleaning that the Queen's reputation was not uniformly saintly. Many questioned her foreign allies, or muttered about the Targaryen madness that might lurk beneath her calm demeanor. Yet no one dared speak too loudly, in case a Targaryen guard was within earshot. In the days that followed, Walgrave realized that traveling to Daenerys's main camp would not be so simple. The roads between Highgarden and King's Landing were precarious, patrolled by Dothraki outriders but also haunted by bandits and renegade Lannister soldiers. Groups of travelers waited for an official escort to ensure safe passage. Walgrave joined one such group, which included a handful of minor nobles from the Reach, several merchants, and 2 septons. They were told they would depart in 4 days. Until then, Walgrave found himself wandering Highgarden's gardens, reflecting on the twists of fate that had brought him here. He also stumbled upon a small library in one of Highgarden's lesser towers. Though it lacked the vastness of the Citadel, it held a modest collection of histories, treatises on horticulture, and genealogies of the Tyrell line. Dust lay thick on the shelves, as no one had tended them properly since the upheaval. Walgrave spent hours browsing the volumes, hoping to distract himself from the swirling uncertainties. Occasionally, a Targaryen guard would poke his head in, but they were polite enough to leave the old maester to his reading. On the second evening, as Walgrave was sorting through a battered history of House Gardner, a line that had ruled the Reach before the Tyrells, he heard voices in the hallway. He rose, heart quickening, and peered out. A pair of Unsullied stood at attention, while a tall figure in black and crimson robes approached. A woman with sharp features and keen eyes. She did not look Westerosi. At a glance, Walgrave guessed she might be from Essos, perhaps a translator or a court official for Daenerys. The woman spotted him and offered a small nod. "You are Maester Walgrave?" she asked in lilting common tongue. I was told you were here. He bowed politely. I am. And you are? Missandei of Noth, she replied, inclining her head. I serve as the Queen's trusted counselor. A flicker of memory surfaced. Walgrave recalled hearing that Daenerys had once freed a brilliant translator in Astapor. This must be the same woman. It is an honor, he said softly. I had hoped to see the Queen herself, though I understand she is not here. Missandei offered a polite, apologetic smile. Her Grace advances each day toward King's Landing. She left a garrison behind, but the rest of her forces move steadily east. I have come to ensure the safe passage of envoys who wish to join the Queen's War Council. Your presence, in particular, was requested. Walgrave felt an odd warmth in his chest, equal parts nerves and curiosity. Then I am ready to depart whenever your escort is formed. My instructions from the Citadel are to observe, nothing more. But I remain at her Grace's disposal for any knowledge or counsel she desires. Missandei studied him with a discerning eye. I recall her speaking fondly of the old maester who dared mention a prophecy. Many in the Queen's retinue are uncertain what to believe, but her Grace values honest men, especially those unafraid to bring hidden knowledge to light. Walgrave flushed. I only did what I thought right. Missandei nodded, her expression kind. We depart in 3 days. Until then, I suggest you rest. The road to King's Landing may be fraught with tension. With that, she excused herself, continuing on her errands. Walgrave, buoyed by the conversation, returned to the library, though his mind drifted from the dusty volumes to thoughts of Daenerys's campaign. If she was indeed forging the final approach on King's Landing, everything might come to a head soon. The Queen's letter had mentioned a siege if the city would not open its gates. Walgrave felt a stab of worry for the innocents caught within those walls. He thought of the prophecy's lines about a city kneeling or burning. Might King's Landing be that city, rather than Oldtown? Perhaps the prophecy had conflated the two, or perhaps it had not. Prophecies were notoriously vague, weaving multiple possibilities into cryptic verses. At dawn, 3 days later, Walgrave joined a sizable caravan that set out from Highgarden under the banner of the three-headed dragon. Missandei rode near the front on a graceful mare, flanked by Unsullied. Dothraki scouts rode ahead, scanning the horizon. The travelers included ambassadors from lesser houses, scribes, and a handful of guards. Walgrave was given a place in a covered wagon alongside 2 septons who spent most of the journey quietly murmuring prayers for peace. As they ventured deeper along the Rose Road, the aftermath of war became increasingly apparent. They passed burned farms, the wreckage of supply wagons, and the occasional cluster of shallow graves marked with makeshift crosses. Villagers watched from a distance, too frightened or weary to greet the caravan. At times, Walgrave glimpsed the silhouette of a dragon winging overhead, scouring for threats. The sight caused a hush among the travelers, even the septons lapsing into awed silence. Nothing in living memory matched the primal power of a living dragon, scion of a near-forgotten age. A week later, they reached the outskirts of King's Landing. Walgrave's first impression was the stench, always worse than Oldtown, a pungent blend of tannery fumes, tallow, and the press of tens of thousands of residents behind battered walls. Smoke from countless chimneys smudged the sky. From a hill, he could see the sprawl of the city hugging Blackwater Bay. The old defensive walls, thick and high, seemed imposing despite rumors that they might be undermanned. Atop those walls, the Lannister lion's standard still flew, though the Targaryen sigil soared in the skies above courtesy of dragons. Missandei informed them that the Queen's host had encamped to the north and south of the city, forming a ring of steel. The Queen herself was said to be in a sprawling war camp near the Blackwater Rush, planning her final moves. They skirted the edge of the capital, the wagon bumping along a rutted road lined by Targaryen sentries. Beyond the city, they came upon a vast encampment stretching across rolling fields. Tents of various sizes and colors dotted the landscape, with the largest bearing black and red banners. War horses stamped at makeshift corrals, and Dothraki mounts roamed open meadows. Unsullied companies drilled in perfect synchrony. Near the heart of it all, 3 dragons lounged in a cordoned area, dozing or snapping at carcasses of butchered livestock. Walgrave's breath caught in his throat at the sheer scale of the beasts. Even from a distance, the heat shimmering off their dark scales made his skin prickle. He wondered which of them had soared above Oldtown's harbor. The caravan was directed toward a cluster of tents reserved for ambassadors. Servants in Targaryen livery helped them dismount and settle in. Walgrave's wagon came to a stop, and he stepped down, wincing at the ache in his back. Missandei, astride her mare, guided him gently forward. "We have prepared a tent for you, Maester. Her Grace is in council this evening, but she will grant you a private audience soon." Walgrave bowed in gratitude, noticing that around them the war camp buzzed with urgent activity. Soldiers carried sharpened stakes, blacksmiths hammered away at swords and spearheads, and raven cages stood in neat rows to facilitate swift communication. It was the heartbeat of a siege in waiting. He felt a pang of dread for the city. Had Cersei Lannister refused to negotiate? Was the Queen truly prepared to starve King's Landing into submission? Or, if that failed, to unleash her dragons upon it? His tent proved humble but comfortable. An older knight, a Westerosi man with a lined face, welcomed him with courtesy, introducing himself as Ser Martin, assigned to watch over the camp's guest quarters. Ser Martin offered Walgrave a wooden stool and a basin of water to wash. The maester sat heavily, rubbing his tired eyes. His mind churned with questions. The prophecy's words drifted through his memory again. She shall be reborn at the edge of the world's ruin, pale as starlight, bearing flame to break chains and conquer thrones. If King's Landing was indeed on the cusp of ruin, how would Daenerys choose to proceed? That evening, a summons arrived at last. An unsullied soldier approached the guest tent, informing Walgrave that the Queen was ready to receive him. With unsteady steps, Walgrave followed through the twisting lanes of tents, noticing how the voices around him spoke in multiple tongues: Common Westerosi, Dothraki, High Valyrian, and more besides. The largest tent loomed ahead, illuminated by torches. At its entrance, 2 dragon skulls made of hammered metal stood as grim sentinels. Walgrave felt a quiver of apprehension. He parted the tent flaps and entered a wide circular space warmed by braziers. Several figures gathered around a large wooden war table. He recognized Grey Worm, the unsullied commander, and Missandei, standing close. There was also a tall, handsome man in polished armor who had the bearing of a knight, and beyond him a woman with curling dark hair, wearing leather traveling clothes, perhaps a northern envoy. In the center stood Daenerys Targaryen. She wore a fitted black gown with red accents. Her silver-gold hair was braided atop her head. Despite the finery, she did not project softness. She radiated an almost tangible force of will. Yet when she saw Walgrave, her expression softened into a small smile. "Maester Walgrave," she greeted him, "I am pleased you have come." He bowed, heart thudding, remembering the last time he had beheld her. "Your Grace, thank you for inviting me. The Citadel. They have allowed me to travel here as an observer." Her gaze flickered with wry amusement. "An observer, yes. That is better than nothing, I suppose." She motioned for him to approach. "We will speak privately in a moment. I must conclude business with my generals. You may wait here or in the adjoining chamber." Walgrave inclined his head respectfully. "I shall wait here with your leave." Daenerys turned back to the war table, where a map of King's Landing and its environs lay spread out. Grey Worm, the knight, and the dark-haired woman were discussing potential strategies to blockade the city's main gates. Walgrave studied the map from a slight distance. He noted that the Blackwater Rush was heavily fortified by Targaryen forces on both banks, preventing any relief supplies from entering the city by river. The roads east were similarly cut off. The looming question was whether Cersei Lannister would surrender or attempt a desperate defense. At length, Daenerys concluded the discussion. The knight bowed, departing with Grey Worm, while the dark-haired woman lingered a moment, glancing at Walgrave with curiosity before stepping outside. Now Daenerys faced Walgrave directly, only Missandei remaining at her side. "It's been some time since Oldtown," she said softly, gesturing for Walgrave to sit on a cushioned bench near a brazier. "You look well despite the journey. Have you had any trouble on the roads?" Walgrave settled gingerly. "Some signs of bandits, but your soldiers kept us safe. I must say, your forces are extensive." Daenerys managed a small nod. "They must be, for Cersei remains entrenched in the Red Keep. I've offered her terms that would spare the city, but she refuses to yield. Each day that passes, more small folk starve within those walls. I fear time is not on their side." Walgrave's gaze fell to his wrinkled hands. "It pains me to hear of common folk suffering. War seldom spares them. What do you intend, if I may ask?" She exhaled, voice tinged with frustration. "I wish to avoid slaughter, but Cersei would see the city burn before she kneels. Even the lords loyal to her are beginning to doubt, but she clings to power. If she forces my hand, I'll do what must be done. My advisors counsel me on caution, reminding me that a queen who incinerates her subjects cannot hope to rule them afterward." Her frankness reminded Walgrave of the rumors swirling about the fate of King's Landing. He ventured cautiously, "What if Cersei tries something drastic?" Wildfire was rumored to have been stashed throughout the city in the days of the Mad King. Might she use that as a final blow? Daenerys's jaw tightened. "We have reason to believe she's searching for caches. My men have found some near the city walls, though not as many as rumored. If she attempts it, she might do as much harm to her own people as to us." Then her gaze shifted. "But enough of war talk. I asked you here because I believe the Citadel must be part of a new realm if I succeed in taking the throne. The people will need maesters who are not hostile to change. I hoped the Citadel might send a delegation, not just an observer. But perhaps that was too much to hope." Walgrave offered an apologetic incline of his head. "Archmaester Hanias is less than receptive to Targaryen rule. Some of the others share his caution or fear, but a few remain open-minded. For now, I come alone, though I suspect over time, the Citadel might relent. Once the realm stabilizes, I think you will find more maesters willing to serve." Daenerys nodded, though her expression revealed a flicker of disappointment. "I cannot force them to trust me. Trust must be earned. But at least you are here. That is a beginning." She paused, as though searching his face for something deeper. Her voice lowered. "Tell me, do you still keep any memory of that old prophecy? The one you hinted at in Oldtown?" A small jolt ran through Walgrave. He glanced at Missandei, uncertain if the queen wished her to hear. Daenerys seemed to catch his hesitation and gestured lightly. "Missandei knows all my secrets, Maester Walgrave. Speak freely." Walgrave swallowed, steeling his nerves. "Archmaester Hanias destroyed the scroll, as I told you might happen. But I managed to save a single scrap and also wrote down fragments of the text from memory. I have them hidden in my trunk, though the Citadel forbade me from sharing them. It could be dangerous knowledge, or so they claim." Daenerys's expression turned thoughtful. "Knowledge is only dangerous to those who fear it. May I see these fragments?" Walgrave nodded slowly. "Yes, Your Grace, but I must caution that it is incomplete, and prophecy can be twisted in many ways. You yourself said you would not be ruled by old words." She offered a faint smile. "I will not be ruled by them, but I will not ignore them either if they might hold any insight. Bring them to me when you can." Walgrave promised to do so, and Daenerys gently turned the conversation to lighter matters. How he found Highgarden, the state of the roads, the general mood of Oldtown. Walgrave answered politely, mindful of how exhausted she must be, carrying the weight of this siege. When Missandei finally ushered him outside, the evening air felt charged with tension. Torches flickered across the war camp, and the silhouettes of watchmen stood like statues in the gloom. Back in his assigned tent, Walgrave pried open his trunk and retrieved his coded notes along with the half-burned scrap. Holding them in his hands, he felt an old man's uncertainty. Was he about to encourage something that might lead to more destruction? But then he recalled the queen's words about sparing the city. If she truly needed guidance, maybe these half-forgotten lines would at least show her how precarious prophecy could be. That night, Walgrave barely slept. He dozed fitfully, dreaming of a city in flames, except it wasn't Oldtown but King's Landing. The high tower rose bizarrely from the city's skyline, merging with the Red Keep. In the dream, dragons shrieked overhead, while bells tolled and people fled. He woke in a sweat, heart hammering. The lines of the prophecy rang in his mind, though he could not discern their meaning in the swirl of half-sleep. At dawn, an unsullied guard arrived with a formal request. The queen wished to see Walgrave again in her tent. He dressed hurriedly, carefully tucking the prophecy fragments into a leather folio, which he slipped under his arm. Outside, the war camp was already astir, with horns sounding in the distance. Something was happening near the city walls. Soldiers hustled to formation, while riders galloped along the perimeter. Walgrave followed the Unsullied as fast as his old legs allowed. Inside the queen's tent, the atmosphere was tense. Daenerys stood with several advisors, including the knight in polished armor, Ser Jorah Mormont, Walgrave later learned, and the dark-haired woman, who spoke with a northern accent, evidently Lady Brienne of Tarth. They appeared to be discussing a small skirmish that had erupted near the Mud Gate. Cersei's men had tried a sortie, but the Dothraki swiftly repelled them. Now dozens lay dead on both sides, and the city gates were closed once more. As soon as Daenerys spotted Walgrave, she beckoned him over. "I'm sorry for the chaos," she said, voice taut with frustration. "Cersei is testing our lines. She knows I hesitate to unleash the dragons on the city itself. In any case, I asked you here for the prophecy fragments. If you still wish to share them, now is the time." Walgrave glanced around. "Do you prefer privacy, Your Grace?" She hesitated, then nodded at her gathered advisors. "Lady Brienne, Ser Jorah, you may remain. Missandei, of course. The rest, please give us a moment." Several officers quietly left. Daenerys guided Walgrave to a smaller table near the tent's rear. Walgrave laid out the half-burned scrap, carefully flattening its scorched edges. Next to it, he placed his coded notes, then produced a carefully written translation of the lines he remembered. He spoke in a soft tone, conscious of the significance of this moment. "This scrap is the only surviving piece of the original parchment," he said. "It reads in an archaic form of High Valyrian, something akin to born of storm and salt, crowned by flame, the breaker of iron. The rest is lost. My recollection of the main text includes references to a queen reborn after the doom of Valyria, destined to bring either salvation or destruction. It specifically mentions an old city that will kneel or burn, and a great war that tests the queen's heart. Much was obscure. These lines are all we have." Daenerys's expression was contemplative. Ser Jorah peered at the scrap with a guarded frown, while Lady Brienne studied it with a soldier's stoicism. Missandei stepped closer to read the Valyrian text. "It aligns with many tales the queen has live." Missandei murmured. "Stormborn, walked through flames to birth dragons, and she has broken the chains of slaves." Walgrave agreed. "Indeed, but as I've said, prophecy can be a two-edged sword. It might embolden your enemies if they learn of it, or it might inspire them to claim you're fated to be a tyrant." Daenerys gave a small shrug, eyes never leaving the half-burned scrap. "I have no desire to be a tyrant. If prophecy claims I might be, then I must prove it wrong. Or if it says I am a savior, I must earn that indeed. Nothing is decided." Ser Jorah, arms folded, remarked quietly, "Your Grace, I've seen men twist prophecy to justify horrors. Yet I've also seen how your own life matches parts of these words. I don't place my faith in riddles, but I know you. You do what is right." Lady Brienne's voice was calm, resonant. "If a prophecy drives you to become what it predicts, then it's no longer prophecy, but self-fulfilling. Far better to do what honor demands, with or without some ancient verse." Daenerys touched the scrap gently, as if the fragile parchment might hold answers. I have come too far to let the ghost of an ancient text decide my path. But I thank you, Maester Walgrave, for trusting me with this. The Citadel believed it was too dangerous. I do not. I believe knowledge should guide us, not terrify us. Walgrave felt a surge of gratitude. That is all I ever wanted, to preserve knowledge and allow those who lead to consider it carefully. Daenerys nodded, then carefully rolled the scrap in a cloth, handing it to Missandei. Keep this safe. Let no one else handle it without my leave. Missandei bowed her head. Daenerys turned back to Walgrave. Thank you. I will remember this gesture. Now, if only more maesters at the Citadel shared your perspective, we might have a future built on truth rather than fear. In that moment, a horn blast sounded from outside, followed by hurried voices. Ser Jorah excused himself to investigate. Daenerys braced herself, tension rippling through her posture. Walgrave could see the exhaustion in her eyes. The weight of war, prophecy, and the fate of thousands all pressed on her. She took a breath, forcing a steady calm. We must attend to the day's demands. Maester, I ask that you remain near. When the siege ends, I will hold a council to set forth a new vision for the realm. Your presence, and the Citadel's knowledge, could prove invaluable. Walgrave stood, bowing deeply. I will remain as long as you permit, Your Grace. She offered a faint smile. Thank you. Before he left, Walgrave's gaze lingered on the Queen's face, seeing not only the conqueror but the uncertain young woman who had chosen to spare Oldtown. He hoped that humanity would endure in her, for the realm's sake. As he stepped outside, the bright morning sun struck him with almost painful clarity. Targaryen soldiers scurried about, and in the distance, he saw thin columns of smoke rising near King's Landing's walls. A fresh assault or some provocation from Cersei's defenders. Perhaps, he thought grimly, the final confrontation was closer than ever. In the days that followed, Walgrave hovered in the war camp, gleaning what he could of the city's plight. Refugees slipped out of King's Landing by night, describing dwindling food supplies, riots in Flea Bottom, and the fanatical brutality of the remaining Lannister loyalists. Daenerys repeatedly sent messengers demanding surrender. Cersei refused. Each morning, the tension mounted. Soldiers whispered that if the Queen unleashed her dragons, the city might fall in hours. But at what cost? Walgrave spoke occasionally with other envoys who arrived, including some lords from the Crownlands who had slipped through the lines to pledge fealty. They admired Daenerys' restraint but worried she might lose the advantage if the siege dragged on. Walgrave, for his part, felt a deepening worry that either side might spark a massacre. The prophecy's lines about the city that kneels or burns echoed in his mind, though he prayed that kneeling would prevail. He saw Daenerys only in passing, glimpsing her discussing war plans with generals or returning from an aerial survey on Dragonback. The force of her presence was undeniable. At last, an event shook the camp to its core. Late one afternoon, a battered group of refugees emerged from the city, carrying white flags. Among them was a highborn lady recognized by some of Daenerys' advisors as a minor cousin of House Lannister. She pleaded for an audience, explaining that Cersei had refused to feed the poor, hoarding supplies for her soldiers. Riots had erupted, and some gates were forced open by starving commoners. Daenerys' outriders entered to restore order, leading to a chaotic skirmish in which Lannister guards fired arrows into fleeing crowds. By the time the dust settled, hundreds lay dead. The final straw had been a segment of the city's walls collapsing under neglect, allowing more of Daenerys' forces to slip in. Within hours, the horns of the Targaryen camp sounded a general advance. The siege was effectively broken from within. Walgrave, peering from a vantage point near the rear lines, saw the city's gates wide open. Dothraki and Unsullied poured through. Civilians stumbled out, half-starved and terrified. Over the rooftops soared a single dragon, blasting pockets of Lannister resistance that refused to yield. Walgrave's heart pounded in horror at the potential devastation. But as the day wore on, it became clear that Daenerys had ordered her forces to spare civilians whenever possible. The dragon's flames targeted only segments of the outer walls where Lannister archers had gathered. The queen herself entered through the main gate on foot, a column of Unsullied behind her. By twilight, King's Landing fell. The Red Keep remained the last holdout. Walgrave learned through bits of frantic news that Cersei had locked herself inside, guarded by a handful of loyal knights. Daenerys's ground forces surrounded the keep, preparing for a final push. Rumor said the queen might offer terms one last time, but no one expected Cersei to accept them. Walgrave could only wait, stomach churning, dreading that the Red Keep might become a slaughterhouse. He heard the city's bells begin to toll, a frantic, discordant ringing that soon spread across multiple septs and towers. The common folk, so often told that bells signaled surrender or danger, now seemed uncertain what to do. Some cowered in their homes, others roamed the streets in panic. Walgrave prayed that the next hours would not echo the worst of Targaryen history. He decided he must see for himself. Gathering what courage he had, Walgrave made his way into the city, accompanied by a small escort of Targaryen guards who recognized his maester's chain. The streets were strewn with rubble, bodies, and the wailing of the wounded. Yet the chaos was not as all-consuming as he might have feared. Groups of Unsullied stood watch, preventing looting. Dothraki roamed in uneasy clusters, checking for surviving Lannister soldiers. Smoke drifted from the remains of catapults near the walls. The bells clanged overhead, a cacophony that jarred every nerve. Walgrave's escort guided him toward the Red Keep, where an impromptu war council had formed just outside the fortress gates. As they approached, Walgrave saw Daenerys astride a horse, her face drawn and weary. Her dragon perched atop a ruined tower behind her, roaring at the stench of death. Grey Worm, Ser Jorah, and others encircled the queen, speaking urgently. Fires flickered along the ramparts, revealing Lannister banners half-torn. The main gates to the keep were battered, smoke curling from the timbers. The defenders had evidently set traps or poured oil. Daenerys's men had partially broken through, but progress was slow. Walgrave stepped closer, bowing to Daenerys when she noticed him. "Your Grace," he said, voice trembling with the enormity of the scene. "Has there been word from Cersei?" Daenerys's expression was grim. "Only curses. She refuses to surrender. The small council inside is in disarray. Some wish to open the gates. Others vow to die with their queen. Our men are trying to break through without slaughtering everyone." Walgrave hesitated. The city's bells hammered at his ears. "Is there a chance she might come out peacefully?" Daenerys glared at the fortress. "She's had chance after chance. Yet I will offer one final mercy. I will ride to the gate and demand she open it. If she does not, we will breach it fully." She paused, as if grappling with her next words. "Perhaps I should mount my dragon, incinerate the gates, and be done. But that would risk those inside who are only following orders. I do not want a massacre, but each moment we delay costs more lives." The old prophecy, kneel or burn, flashed into Walgrave's mind. He dared not mention it now. Instead, he said gently, "Your Grace, I cannot pretend to advise you on tactics, but you have shown mercy thus far. If you can grant one more chance, do so. Let it be known that you extended your hand." She nodded, spurring her horse forward. Grey Worm and the others formed up around her. They advanced to the foot of the keep's final gate. Walgrave remained a short distance behind, heart pounding. By torchlight, Daenerys called out in a ringing voice that carried over the tumult. "Cersei Lannister, the city has fallen. Surrender now, and I promise you a fair trial. Do not let your stubborn pride cost more lives." Silence, save for the clang of the bells and the crackle of distant fires. Then a shrill reply sounded from within the gatehouse, an officer of the crown, voice trembling with defiance. "We hold for the rightful queen. Begone, usurper!" An arrow whistled out, narrowly missing Daenerys' standard-bearer. Grey Worm's spear snapped up, but Daenerys raised a hand to stay him. A second arrow flew, striking an Unsullied in the shoulder. He staggered but did not cry out. Daenerys's face turned taut with anger. She pulled back, hissing to her men. I gave them the chance. Break the gates. Secure the keep. Take prisoners where possible. But do not risk your lives unnecessarily. The Unsullied advanced, ramming a portable battering ram against the weakened doors. At the same time, the Black Dragon swooped in low, unleashing a jet of flame that scorched the upper battlements, sending Lannister archers screaming. Walgrave shielded his face from the intense heat. He felt as though the prophecy's darkest lines were playing out before him. Yet Daenerys was not unleashing her full wrath on innocents. She was carefully targeting the armed defenders. Even so, the chaos was ferocious. The bells kept clanging in madness, amplifying the sense of unstoppable violence. Within minutes, the Red Keep's doors collapsed. Unsullied poured in, Dothraki at their flanks. Resistance was fierce at first, but many Lannister guards, seeing the hopelessness, threw down their arms. Here and there, fires roared. Walgrave glimpsed Daenerys riding inside, Grey Worm at her side, the dragon's roars echoing overhead. If Cersei did not yield, Walgrave realized, this final confrontation might be bloody indeed. Hesitating at the threshold, Walgrave found the courage to follow at a distance, navigating the smoldering gatehouse. Inside the keep's outer courtyard, the scene was chaos. Battered knights kneeling or lying wounded, flickers of flame in the corners. Daenerys had dismounted, striding resolutely toward the main hall. Her men parted to let her through. Walgrave trailed behind, telling himself this was his duty as a witness. He had to see how this ended. Once inside the cavernous hall, he saw Cersei Lannister at the far end, flanked by 2 gold-cloaked guards and a battered Kingsguard knight. She wore a torn gown and clutched a goblet of wine in one hand. Her eyes blazed with a defiance that bordered on madness. Bodies of her loyal court littered the floor, victims of crossfire or betrayal. Daenerys stopped halfway across the hall, surrounded by Unsullied forming a protective arc. The hush that fell was broken only by the distant clang of bells and the crackling of small fires. You have lost, Daenerys said, voice echoing. Yield now. Spare yourself and your people more bloodshed. Cersei spat, letting her goblet fall. You call yourself a savior, but you are the same as your father. Fire and blood. Only a matter of time before you burn this city like he would have. Daenerys's fists tightened. You speak of madness while you starve your own subjects and murder them in the streets. The time for illusions is over. Surrender. For a moment, Cersei's lips trembled, and Walgrave thought she might throw herself at Daenerys's mercy. But instead, she let out a bitter laugh. Surrender? To you? I'd sooner die. She broke off, eyes going wide. The last gold cloak behind her suddenly turned, dropping his sword in a gesture of defeat. One of the remaining Knights Guard also fell to his knees, tears in his eyes. They had no more will to fight. Rage contorted Cersei's features. She stumbled back, as though physically struck by the betrayal. In that instant, Grey Worm and 2 Unsullied rushed forward, wrestling Cersei to the ground, disarming her. She shrieked, struggling, but she was no match for them. Daenerys lifted her chin, a swirl of conflicting emotions crossing her face. Relief, triumph, perhaps pity. The bells outside continued their frantic toll. Walgrave let out a long breath. The city was taken, and the Queen did not have to unleash her full dragonfire. Despite all the horror, it was a lesser horror than it could have been. The silence that followed felt deafening, an aftershock of violence. Daenerys finally spoke, her voice resonating with finality. Cersei of House Lannister, you are my prisoner. The war is over. Guards hauled Cersei away, spitting curses. The Red Keep was Daenerys's. King's Landing, battered but largely spared from total immolation, fell under Targaryen rule once more. Outside, the bells eventually ceased their maddening toll, replaced by a deep, broken hush. People emerged from their hiding places. The victors raised Targaryen banners on every tower, and the battered Lannister insignias were torn down. In the days that followed, Daenerys moved swiftly to restore order. She ordered her soldiers to distribute food from the royal granaries to starving commoners, welcomed them to speak grievances, and forbade looting on penalty of death. The city reeled from the abrupt change, but many residents seemed relieved that total destruction had not come. Some might curse her as a conqueror, but more recognized that she had shown greater mercy than they expected from any invader. Walgrave wandered the streets, assisting where he could, tending to the wounded. He found the destruction vast but not irreparable. Slain men lay in rows for burial, but entire neighborhoods remained intact. Was this the prophecy's city of ash, or had it been spared that fate? Eventually, Daenerys summoned Walgrave to the throne room. The Iron Throne still loomed at the far end, an ugly mass of twisted swords. The hall bore scorch marks from small fires that had broken out, but it was mostly intact. As Walgrave entered, he saw Daenerys standing near the throne, her hand lightly touching the cold steel. Missandei, Ser Jorah, and Lady Brienne were nearby. Cersei's defeat was a fact, yet the mood was subdued, perhaps out of awe at how close the city had come to a fiery end. Walgrave bowed deeply. Daenerys offered him a weary smile. "Maester Walgrave, the city is mine, though I will not sit this throne until a formal coronation. I plan a great council soon. Lords from across Westeros will be invited to shape the realm's future. I want the Citadel to be part of that future, if they wish." He inclined his head. "I will inform the Citadel that you have taken King's Landing with far less bloodshed than feared, Your Grace. Perhaps that will ease their concerns. Though I cannot promise Archmaester Hanias will be swayed." Daenerys's eyes flickered with determination. "He will see reason, or he may choose to remain in seclusion. Regardless, the realm needs wise counsel, not secrecy. And I do not mean to spurn the Citadel, but to include it on fair terms." Walgrave found himself moved by her sincerity. "Then I will do all I can. And, about the prophecy, Your Grace, you did not let it drive you to wrath. You showed restraint." She exhaled softly, glancing at the throne of swords. "If I had listened to the darker voices, within or without, I might have turned this city to ash. That's what many expected. But I refuse to be the monster they name me. Let prophecy speak what it will. My choices are mine. I've broken the chains in the east, and I mean to break the cycle of slaughter here as well." A surge of relief washed through Walgrave. In that moment, he saw a glimpse of the queen the realm might embrace. Flawed, tested by fire, but not consumed by it. He hoped the world would see her that way. He knew how quickly rumors could overshadow truth. The lines of the prophecy murmured in his mind. She who was reborn to break chains, to stand at the threshold of a city's ruin, yet choose a path of relative mercy. Perhaps some part of that ancient text had come true, but in a manner that defied the worst expectations. Daenerys turned to face the hall, the quiet at her back. "I will hold a gathering in a week's time. All lords within reach will be invited, as will the Faith, the Citadel, and any who wish to build a peaceful realm. The war is over, but the real work begins now, forging unity where there's been only division." Walgrave bowed again, voice trembling with emotion. "I am at your service, Your Grace. I may be old, but I will do what I can." She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, the weight of it surprisingly warm. "Your knowledge and counsel are more valuable than you know." "Thank you, Maester Walgrave." In the week that followed, King's Landing stirred with the slow beginnings of hope. Daenerys's men worked tirelessly to restore order, quell any lingering Lannister pockets, and ensure that essential services, food, water, sanitation, were tended. Messages flew by Raven to every corner of Westeros, proclaiming the defeat of Cersei and inviting them to come and make peace under the new queen's auspices. Of course, no one expected the entire realm to kneel in an instant. Some Baratheon loyalists remained hidden. The Iron Islands still bristled. The North might claim independence. But for now, a fragile calm settled, one that might, if handled wisely, become more lasting than any time since the Targaryens first conquered the continent. Amid the flurry, Walgrave penned a careful letter to the Citadel. He described the siege, the final stand in the Red Keep, and Daenerys's measured approach. He stressed that, though the queen might come from a line of conquerors, she had shown remarkable restraint. He gently urged the citadel to consider sending a small delegation to her upcoming council. He addressed it to Archmaester Raghan, bypassing Hanias's direct authority. Perhaps that small defiance would cost him dearly, but Walgrave could not see any other way to push for a truly open dialogue. Each day, Daenerys received petitioners in the throne room, lords who scrambled to bend the knee, townsfolk who pleaded for relief, or freedmen from Essos seeking to confirm her continuing pledge to end slavery. Walgrave often stood near the edges of these audiences, noting how calmly she navigated each plea. He saw moments of stern resolve when a Lannister knight tried to justify cruelty, but also moments of empathy when a battered mother begged for bread. He thought of the prophecy's line about forging new bond. S in fire. Indeed, Daenerys had used fire but also temperance to create alliances. She was no saint, but neither was she the monstrous tyrant some feared. One evening, Walgrave walked the ramparts of the Red Keep, gazing over a city still pocked by smoke and ruin. From up here, he could see flickers of torchlight along the streets, a sign of life continuing. The black dragon soared overhead, letting out a guttural call, as though claiming the night air. Walgrave remembered the dream that had haunted him. A city burned to ash, yet reality, while bloody, had spared a great deal from the flames. The question lingered. Would Daenerys's reign continue to show such restraint? Or would the realm's inevitable challenges push her to unleash the darker side of her inheritance? A soft voice startled him from his reverie. "Maester Walgrave, you stand watch like a sentinel." He turned to see Missandei approaching, her braided hair reflecting the moonlight. She offered a gentle smile. "The queen asked if you were well. You've been quiet these past days." Walgrave sighed, leaning on the stone battlement. "I am well enough, my lady, just pondering the fragility of peace, and the weight of what has happened." Missandei nodded, joining him at the wall. "So much has changed so quickly. I served Daenerys in Essos, watched her free cities and break chains. But Westeros is a different land, with deep scars and old grudges. Still, I believe she will strive for peace." Walgrave pressed his lips together. "I believe so as well, yet the realm is vast. Many do not know her as we do. They only hear rumors and see dragons overhead. Fear is a powerful force." Missandei's gaze drifted across the moonlit city. "She knows this. It pains her that people fear her more than they love her. But it is a reality of conquest. In time, perhaps, her deeds will speak louder." Walgrave smiled wearily. "In Oldtown, I once read a line from an old poet. Fear is the winter, love is the spring. If she nurtures seeds of kindness, maybe the realm will come to bloom." Missandei's dark eyes glowed with quiet warmth. "A beautiful sentiment, Maester. I'll remember it." Then she paused, as though steeling herself. "The queen also asked me to say that, when her council gathers, she wants you by her side as an advisor. Not just an observer, but someone who can speak truth about history, knowledge, and yes, prophecy if needed." Walgrave's heart fluttered. "That is an honor I scarcely deserve." "She believes otherwise," Missandei said gently. "You helped shape events by sharing that prophecy. You may have prevented a far greater tragedy, simply by offering her a reminder of what she did not wish to become. You have proven your loyalty is to knowledge, not to petty politics." Walgrave felt tears prick his eyes. "If I have done any good, it is because the queen chose mercy on her own. I merely showed her a glimpse of possibilities." Missandei rested a hand on his shoulder. "That may be so, but we all need guidance in dark moments. She will ask more of you soon. Prepare yourself. This realm is hungry for stable leadership, but we stand at a crossroad." With that, she drifted away, leaving Walgrave to the hush of the night. He remained a while longer, the wind tugging at his robes, the moon's light illuminating the battered city. He thought of the half-burned scrap, safely kept in Daenerys' possession now. The lines that survived described her so well, yet they did not chain her to some monstrous destiny. Prophecy had proven to be a guidepost, not a prison. Days lengthened into a fortnight. Daenerys's call for a great council brought a trickle of lords and knights into the city, each greeted by Unsullied at the gates. Some arrived anxiously, uncertain if they would be forgiven for supporting the Lannisters. Others came seeking favor or wealth. A few came from distant corners, curious about this new queen who claimed to want a fresh start for Westeros. The Faith of the Seven also sent representatives, hoping to ensure that the city's spiritual life would be respected. The air buzzed with political maneuvering, alliances forming or dissolving in whispered corners. Walgrave observed it all with a mixture of fascination and caution. The Targaryen victory had been swift, but for that victory to become a lasting peace, Daenerys needed to show she was more than just a conqueror. Every dawn, ravens departed the Red Keep, carrying missives to other kingdoms. Walgrave sometimes assisted in drafting these letters, extolling the benefits of unity and guaranteeing safe passage. Archmaester Hanias never replied to Walgrave's letter, nor did the Citadel send an official delegation. But at least one young maester, Ferrys, from the stories Walgrave had heard, arrived, claiming he had the blessings of a few archmaesters who dared defy Hanias's conservative stance. It was a start. At last, the appointed day arrived. The throne room filled with a crowd of highborn guests, knights, merchants, maesters, and freedmen from Essos. Guards lined the columns wearing Targaryen colors. Daenerys entered from the far side, flanked by Grey Worm and Missandei, while the crowd parted in a hush. She moved to stand beside the Iron Throne, though she did not seat herself. The hush grew palpable. Walgrave stood to one side, heart pounding. This was the moment Daenerys had promised. A gathering not to punish, but to rebuild. Lady Brienne, standing near the front, gave him a small nod of acknowledgement. Ser Jorah lingered behind the queen. Dozens of lords and envoys shuffled, glancing uneasily at each other, uncertain how this new order would function. Daenerys raised a hand. "Thank you for coming," she began, voice carrying. "I know many of you fought against me. Others stood aside, waiting to see who would prevail. The time for war is over. I offer you peace. In return, I ask for your loyalty, not to me alone, but to the idea that Westeros can be more than a battleground for the ambitions of a few." She paused, letting her words settle. A murmur passed through the ranks. Then she continued, describing her vision. A realm where the Targaryen monarchy served the people instead of demanding blind obedience. A realm that strove to end old cycles of revenge, that recognized the independence of cultures like the Iron Islands and the North if they so desired, but also sought cooperation in defense and trade. She spoke of forging new laws to protect small folk, new systems to ensure that knowledge and healing reached every corner of Westeros. She invoked the memory of the freedmen from across the sea, people who had once been slaves and now stood as free allies, testament to the possibility of change. Walgrave watched the crowd. Some listened with earnest hope, others with suspicion. Yet Daenerys pressed on, acknowledging that trust would not be won overnight. "Let this council be the first step," she declared. "Any who have grievances or proposals, step forward. Let us speak openly, forging a path that can endure beyond the next war." Throughout the day, lords presented themselves, some kneeling, some hesitating. Debates flared over past conflicts. Daenerys listened, sometimes deferring to her advisors, sometimes making swift decisions. When an argument arose about the Citadel's reluctance to dispatch maesters to certain war-torn areas, Daenerys beckoned Walgrave forward. "Maester Walgrave, you have seen how valuable knowledge can be. Will you speak on the importance of the Citadel's involvement?" Walgrave inhaled, stepping into the open floor. Heads turned to regard the stooped old man with his chain glinting in the torchlight. Gathering his courage, he spoke. "My lords, ladies, freedmen, and travelers from Essos, knowledge is not the property of a select few. It must be shared if it is to serve. The Citadel's mission is to further the well-being of this realm by training maesters skilled in medicine, ravenry, and other disciplines. Yet we have often hidden behind neutrality, refusing to engage with the changes shaping the land. Her grace has opened a door for us to participate in forging a better future for all. It is my hope that the citadel will walk through it. A hush followed. Walgrave glanced at the cluster of lords who served under House Hightower, uncertain if they recognized him. But he pressed on, voice resonating in the solemn hall. We need not fear new leadership if that leadership respects the realm's need for wisdom. I have seen Daenerys Targaryen show mercy when she might have chosen devastation. I say this not as propaganda, but as a witness. She wields power, great power, but seeks counsel to temper it. If the Citadel and other institutions do not step forward, we abandon our duty to guide the realm with learning and reason. A silence, then scattered murmurs. Daenerys gave him an appreciative nod. Walgrave backed away, heart hammering. He felt the tension in the room. Some lords might interpret his words as flattery or submission, but others looked genuinely thoughtful. And so the discussions continued. Freedmen representatives asked for alliances in trade, promising new forms of commerce between Westeros and the Free Cities. A handful of knights raised concerns about Dothraki riders and Unsullied occupying the countryside. Daenerys responded with patient clarity. Once stability was assured, those warriors would either be garrisoned or sent home if they desired, but it would not happen overnight. Through it all, Walgrave sensed the precarious nature of the moment. One spark of violence, one misstep from the Queen, and all these discussions could spiral back into war. But step by step, compromise by compromise, the day wore on, culminating in a shared meal in the throne room. Daenerys did not seat herself on the Iron Throne once, an unspoken symbol that her rule would not be overshadowed by the old ways of intimidation. Instead, she stood or walked among the crowd, listening, speaking plainly. Even the Faith's Septons seemed impressed that she sought to mend the city's woes so soon after seizing it. When the gathering ended, Walgrave retreated to a quiet corridor, exhausted. Missandei found him and placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "You spoke well, Maester. Even those who resist cannot deny your sincerity." He nodded, voice raw. "I only hope the Citadel might hear what happened here today. Perhaps they'll see that knowledge can guide a realm without being twisted into secrecy." Missandei smiled. "A new dawn, we hope." In the weeks that followed, Daenerys' hold on King's Landing strengthened. The Red Keep was repaired, the city's gates reopened to trade, and incremental steps were taken to unify lords who had been scattered by war. Tales of the final siege circulated through the realm. Many were dramatized, painting Daenerys as either a glorious liberator or a fearsome tyrant. But the reality was more nuanced. She had conquered the city, yes, and forced a surrender, but had done so with far less devastation than her ancestors. Walgrave hoped that, in time, truth would supplant rumor. Amid these developments, Walgrave continued to advise the Queen in small ways, drafting letters or conferring on points of Westerosi history. He felt less like a mere observer and more like a reluctant participant in shaping the future. When a raven at last arrived from Oldtown, he read it with trembling anticipation. It was from Archmaester Raghan, who cautiously congratulated him on surviving the siege and expressed mild interest in Daenerys' invitation to send more maesters. Hanias's name did not appear. Walgrave took it as a promising sign. The Citadel might eventually relent. One crisp morning, Daenerys convened her close advisors in the Red Keep's garden. Walgrave was there, along with Missandei, Ser Jorah, Grey Worm, Lady Brienne, and a few others. They discussed broad plans, ensuring the Crownlands were pacified, negotiating with the North about their demands for semi-independence, addressing rumors of an Iron Islands incursion. Through it all, Daenerys listened intently, her posture poised. She had the bearing of a queen who recognized that forging alliances was more complex than toppling enemies. When the meeting finished, she asked Walgrave to walk with her among the hedges. The garden was battered from the siege but still offered pockets of greenery. She paused by a rosebush struggling to bloom. "Maester Walgrave, I have a question that has weighed on me," she began. "The prophecy spoke of the city that kneels or burns. You believed it referred to Oldtown, yet it may have foreshadowed King's Landing. We avoided the worst of that fate. Do you think there is more to come, or have we escaped its shadow? Walgrave clasped his hands, pondering. Prophecies rarely speak in simple terms. We may have fulfilled one aspect by sparing King's Landing, but the realm is large and new trials await. Some lines speak of a great darkness from the north. Others speak of forging alliances in the wake of a storm. It is possible that the prophecy intended to warn us of more than a single siege. Yet no scroll can detail every turn of mortal choice. Daenerys nodded solemnly. The darkness from the north, some mention White Walkers. I have heard rumors from the Night's Watch of strange sightings. Part of me wonders if that is but legend. Yet I learned from my experiences in Essos that legends can hold truths. Walgrave felt a chill. The Citadel traditionally dismisses the White Walkers as myth, but I have read older accounts that are less certain. If there is any threat from beyond the wall, it would test all of us in ways we cannot imagine. We should not scoff too readily. She brushed a stray leaf aside. Then I must be vigilant. The realm may one day need unity against a threat far worse than petty kings. This victory in King's Landing is only the beginning. Walgrave studied her face. So young, yet burdened with the weight of prophecy, conquest, and potential cataclysm. He placed a gentle hand over hers. Your Grace, whether the prophecy stirs again or not, we face the future with our choices. If you remain as you have been, seeking justice over cruelty, then you will have allies enough. The realm will rally if the threat proves real. You must trust yourself. She met his gaze, her lilac eyes fierce yet somehow tender. Thank you, Maester. I do. And I trust in those who speak truth, even if that truth is difficult to hear. In that moment, Walgrave realized that, for all the horrors that had led them here, the realm had a chance under Daenerys. A chance for a more open rule, guided by knowledge rather than fear, shaped by mercy rather than vengeance. Perhaps that was what the prophecy had hinted at, behind its ominous words. A cycle broken, a chain undone. If so, then Walgrave felt a measure of peace, knowing he had played his small part in guiding her away from the darkest path. Evening settled over King's Landing, warm light spilling through the battered windows of the Red Keep. Servants lit torches and braziers, while outside, the city's denizens went about rebuilding their lives. A new queen sat in the capital, forging alliances and offering glimpses of hope. The Citadel might remain hesitant, but Walgrave believed they would come around once they saw that Daenerys was no mere reincarnation of the Mad King. In the hush of his chamber, Walgrave carefully penned one last entry in his personal journal. We stand at the threshold of an age shaped by the Dragon Queen. The prophecy spoke of flames and ruin, but also rebirth. She has chosen mercy at each critical moment, though the weight of rulership may test her again. This realm has known Targaryens who soared and Targaryens who fell into madness. I pray that Daenerys Stormborn, breaker of chains, will remain faithful to the better angels of her nature. If she does, her reign could herald a dawn beyond the gloom of prophecy. And though the scroll is destroyed, its fragments live on in memory, cautioning us that destiny is not a fixed path but a choice made in the crucible of trial. The future belongs to the living, not to the dead words of old. He set down his quill, closed his eyes, and exhaled. Outside, the night sky gleamed with stars, the city's bells now silent. The Iron Throne stood unoccupied for the moment, an artifact of a violent past. And somewhere above the rooftops, a dragon winged across the moon, a silent promise of both power and possibility. Walgrave felt a tired contentment settle over him. The question of Daenerys Targaryen's conquest, whether it had been heralded by an ancient prophecy, might linger in songs and rumors for generations. Let the bards debate it, he thought. He had seen enough to know that prophecy alone does not rule hearts. Choices do. Daenerys had proven that once already, and he suspected she would prove it again in the days to come, forging a realm that might yet find peace, and perhaps, just perhaps, surpass the old ways that had once drowned it in blood. He drifted into a slumber untroubled by the nightmares of flame and ruin. Outside his window, King's Landing still bore scars, but it stood. The realm still had a chance. And in the silent hours before dawn, that chance felt like the purest fulfillment of the prophecy's hidden promise. That the Dragon Queen, born of storm and salt, crowned by flame, had come not merely to conquer, but to reshape an entire kingdom's fate, walking the line between destruction and salvation, choosing again and again the path of mercy that no scroll could ever have dictated for her.